The lights were blinding. The kind of lights that made you feel small, like an insect caught in a jar. Elijah had never seen them, but he could feel the heat of them on his skin, feel the heavy hum in the air as the spotlight hovered above him like a predator about to strike. It was a feeling that made him want to shrink into the floor, to disappear. But then again, he had always been used to disappearing. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not really. The audience was laughing. It wasn't a cruel laugh, not at first. Just the kind of light, nervous chuckle people gave when they didn't know what to expect. The laughter swelled as Elijah's hands moved hesitantly over the piano keys, trying to find his place. But no one could understand what it was like for him. To play without seeing the keys. To feel the vibrations under his fingers, to listen to the sound, and hope it was the right note. But today, the spotlight was cold. The room had been filled with the elegant clink of crystal glasses, the murmur of excited voices, and the occasional burst of laughter. It was a place of wealth, of power, and of expectations. People who had everything, and they didn't care about the boy standing at the edge of the stage. To them, he was just a novelty, a token gesture. A blind kid from the poor neighborhoods of Atlanta, plucked out of obscurity as part of some ridiculous stunt. "Go on, play," a voice called out from the crowd, and the laughter rippled once more. Elijah didn't respond. His world had always been one of silence, save for the music that lived inside him. It wasn't his fault that the world couldn't see what he felt, what he heard, what he played. But now, he had to prove it. "Come on, kid. Play something. Show us what you've got." The voice was familiar, Sebastian King, the world-famous pianist whose name was synonymous with perfection, fame, and arrogance. He stood off stage, arms crossed, a grin playing at the corners of his lips as he watched Elijah struggle. Sebastian had been mocking him since the moment he stepped onto the stage. The famous pianist had asked for a random contestant to join him on stage, and, well, that's how Elijah had ended up here. The organizers had called it a unique opportunity, but to Elijah, it felt more like a trap. And now, with all eyes on him, he felt the weight of every single expectation crashing down on his shoulders. The audience's laughter had faded into whispers, their curiosity piqued as they waited for Elijah to play something spectacular. But how could he? He had no sheet music in front of him. No cues to follow. Just the steady pulse of the piano beneath his fingertips. The crowd waited. The spotlight burned. He closed his eyes. The silence was deafening. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a question lingered. What would happen if he just ran off the stage? What would happen if he told them that this wasn't a game for him? That his music was his life, not something to be mocked or dissected for entertainment. But before he could act on those thoughts, something inside him shifted. It was his mother's voice that pulled him back. Mama June had always told him, when the world tries to pull you down, Elijah, just play louder. The thought of her. Her soft hands that had once guided his fingers over the keys of an old, out-of-tune piano in their living room, made his resolve harden. Mama June wasn't here to see this moment, but her spirit was. It always was, whispering in his heart like a melody he couldn't forget. He took a deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs, then let his hands fall to the keys. He didn't care about the laughter anymore. He didn't care about the mocking smirks or the arrogance of Sebastian King standing off to the side. What mattered was the music. His fingers moved, slowly at first, feeling the familiar shapes of the black and white keys. Then, with a single breath, Elijah let the music pour from him. It wasn't the piece they were expecting. It wasn't some grand, classical composition that would wow them with its technicality. No, this was something raw, something personal. A song he had written himself. A song that echoed through his soul with a sadness that had haunted him for years. The first few notes were uncertain, fragile, as if the piano itself were unsure whether to trust him. But then, something inside him clicked. His fingers gained confidence, and the music swelled, filling the hall with its haunting beauty. The sound wrapped around him, pulling him deeper into the rhythm, until it felt like he was no longer on stage, no longer a spectacle, but part of something bigger. His world wasn't black and white. It wasn't just sound. It was feeling. It was emotion. It was the warmth of a note held too long and the coolness of one that was let go too soon. It was everything that the world around him could never understand. And yet, for the first time, Elijah felt as though he was no longer alone. The audience, at first stunned, began to fall silent. It wasn't the silence of discomfort, but one of awe. The more Elijah played, the more the world around him seemed to fade. He was no longer in a grand auditorium, surrounded by strangers. No. He was back in his mother's arms, back in the quiet of their small living room, feeling the vibrations of the piano beneath his fingertips, letting the music speak for him. Sebastian King, watching from the sidelines, seemed to have lost his smug grin. His eyes were narrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line as he stared at Elijah, unable to hide the surprise that had spread across his face. For the first time, Sebastian King, the legendary pianist, was the one who was speechless. The final chord rang out, its resonance filling the air with a delicate tremor that lingered long after the sound had faded. Elijah's hands hovered above the keys, his fingers trembling as the silence in the room stretched for what seemed like an eternity. Then, slowly, the applause began. Soft at first, as if unsure, and then louder, building into a storm of cheers and clapping. Elijah sat there, motionless, unable to comprehend what had just happened. He had done it. He had shown them. But then, something unexpected happened. The laughter didn't stop. It had turned into something else, something darker. The mocking undertones were still there, disguised now as admiration. The crowd was impressed by his talent, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they were still in control. And that's when Sebastian King stepped forward, a cold smile spreading across his face. "Not bad, kid," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But it takes more than a few good notes to be a real artist." Elijah froze. The spotlight felt colder now than ever. But this time, he was ready for it. In that moment, he knew that this was just the beginning. The world had seen him. Now, it was time for him to silence it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The world was louder than Elijah had ever known. The applause had faded, but the noise in his mind didn't stop. It was the clattering of confusion, the whirling of thoughts, the sudden surge of attention he'd never asked for. He could still feel the thrum of the piano under his fingers, the final note still echoing in his chest like a heartbeat. He could feel the weight of the stairs on him, heavy and unyielding. The applause, though loud, didn't seem to lift the pressure. Instead, it pressed down on him, making his ribs ache, his heart race. But what was worse than the applause? It was the silence that came after. The kind of silence that spoke louder than any sound. The one that told him he was different. That he didn't belong here. He stood up, slowly, carefully, as though moving in a dream. His fingers were still tingling from the piano, but his legs felt shaky. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he was going to stay upright or collapse under the weight of the world's gaze. "Great performance, kid," a voice said, but it wasn't kind. It wasn't encouraging. It was cold, calculated, and clipped. It was Sebastian King's voice, cutting through the air like a blade. Elijah didn't turn to face him. He didn't need to. He could hear the sneer in Sebastian's words. He knew what was coming next. A comment, a mockery, something to remind him that he was just a joke, a blind boy with no business playing on this stage. But then the audience started to murmur, their voices overlapping, unsure. A few clapped half-heartedly, but the excitement in the room had already shifted. They weren't applauding Elijah for his talent. No, they were applauding him for surviving. Sebastian's figure loomed in Elijah's peripheral vision, still waiting for some kind of reaction. "You played well, but it's just not enough," he said, the words dripping with condescension. "Anyone can plunk at the keys. That doesn't make you a musician." Elijah didn't respond. He couldn't respond. What was there to say? He had played from the heart, from a place deeper than technique, but Sebastian didn't see it. He would never see it. Elijah didn't need his validation. He didn't need anyone's approval. But the sting of Sebastian's words cut deeper than any applause ever could. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he felt like the room was closing in on him, suffocating him with the weight of everyone's expectations. The backstage area was quiet when Elijah stepped off the stage. The walls seemed to close in on him. He could barely make out the figures moving around him, staff, security, people hustling to and fro, oblivious to his presence. A few minutes passed before he heard the voice again. It was deeper this time, softer, but still full of that same biting edge. "You really think you can compete with me?" Sebastian's voice echoed off the walls. "You're nothing but a sideshow act. A novelty, a circus trick." Elijah felt his pulse quicken. Why is he still talking? He wanted to turn, to confront Sebastian and tell him that he had no idea what it meant to play music with nothing but the sound of your heart as a guide. But instead, Elijah closed his eyes, took a breath, and walked away. Mama June's voice came to him in that moment, "Don't let the world tell you who you are, baby." She had said it so many times. He'd almost forgotten what it meant. To her, music wasn't just about playing the right notes, it was about feeling. And Elijah had always felt his way through life, felt his way through music, through everything. He wasn't a sideshow. He wasn't a joke. He was more than just a blind kid who could play the piano. But the world? The world couldn't see him. Back in his hotel room, Elijah sat on the edge of the bed, his fingers still tingling from the touch of the keys. He hadn't had time to process everything, to understand how his performance had been received or what the people in the audience were thinking. All he could focus on was that moment on stage, the way the music had taken over him, and the way it felt like his heart had poured out into every note. But then the sound of a phone ringing pierced through the silence. It was a New York number. His heart skipped. "Hello?" he answered, trying to keep his voice steady, though he could feel the panic rising in his chest. "Elijah." It was a woman's voice, smooth and professional. "This is Carla from the Symphony of Tomorrow program. We've been following your audition. You were impressive." Elijah blinked, confused for a moment. "Impressive?" "The Symphony of Tomorrow," he repeated, feeling a knot in his stomach. Thank you, but I don't think." "You don't need to explain," Carla interrupted gently. "We've seen your work. Your talent is undeniable. We'd like to offer you a position in our upcoming competition. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Elijah. You'd be performing in front of some of the most influential figures in music. We believe in you." Elijah swallowed hard. "This is it. This is real. Would you be interested?" she asked. The silence stretched. Elijah had never been one for big crowds, and the thought of performing in front of the most famous people in the world, people who had never seen someone like him before, made his stomach churn. He thought of Mama June, of her words, "You gotta show them what blind can see, baby." He couldn't back down now. Not after everything. Not after the way he had played, after how the music had felt. "I'm in," Elijah said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind in his chest. "I'll do it." "Great." Carla's voice brightened, and Elijah could hear the smile in her tone. "We'll send you all the details. You'll need to prepare. But we'll help guide you through the process. We believe you'll be a star, Elijah. This is just the beginning." The line went dead, and Elijah dropped the phone onto the bed. The world was shifting beneath his feet, and he was too dizzy to know which way to turn. He sat in the quiet of the room for a long time, the weight of the call settling over him. But then, slowly, the smallest of smiles tugged at the corner of his lips. The applause. The laughter. Sebastian King. It didn't matter. This was his moment. And he was going to take it. The next morning, Elijah woke to a world that seemed impossibly large. The sunlight streamed through the window of his hotel room, bright and intrusive, almost like the spotlight from the night before. The moment he opened his eyes, everything came rushing back. The stage, the laughter, the music, and the challenge that now lay before him. He had been offered an opportunity, one that he knew could change everything. But with that opportunity came the weight of expectations. The kind of weight that made his chest feel tight, his thoughts scatter. Elijah had always been a dreamer, but even the dreams he chased seemed to come with strings attached, strings he had to cut through just to keep his head above water. Can I really do this? Elijah pushed himself up from the bed, his fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the nightstand. His hand reached instinctively for the piano, but there was no instrument here. Only a lingering sense of doubt. The competition, the symphony of tomorrow, wasn't just some local contest. It was a big deal. Thousands of musicians from all over the country would be participating, and only one could claim victory. The prize? A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to perform with world-renowned orchestras and be mentored by the best in the industry. It was the dream Elijah had always whispered to himself in the quietest moments. But it was also a terrifying thought. The pressure was building, slowly but steadily, like a storm on the horizon. It was already hard enough dealing with the world's expectations, especially when they viewed him as an anomaly. As a blind musician, how could he ever compete with others who had their sight, their precise vision of the keys, the notes? They could read sheet music at a glance, they could see the intricacies of the music. Elijah had to feel his way through it, one note at a time, using his intuition, his heart, and the sound of his inner music. How could he possibly stand up to these other prodigies? He sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. He needed to focus. There was no turning back. If this was his shot, he had to give it everything. Everything. You've got this, Elijah. Just play. The days that followed were a blur of rehearsals and practice sessions. Carla from the symphony program had sent him a list of pieces to prepare. Most of them were classical masterpieces, complex and intricate. Some were familiar to him, pieces he'd learned to play from memory over the years. Others were new, and those were the ones that scared him the most. He had always been good at adapting to what he heard, but the idea of learning new pieces without the help of sheet music made him anxious. It was late in the evening when Elijah found himself in the small rehearsal space his hotel had provided, surrounded by empty walls and the faint hum of the air conditioning. There was no grand piano here, just an upright, the keys worn and slightly out of tune, but it would have to do. He settled onto the bench, resting his hands on the cold keys, trying to push all his doubts aside. The music had always been there for him. It had never let him down. It had always been the one thing that made sense. And now, more than ever, it had to be his guide. He began with a piece by Chopin, his fingers tracing the familiar rhythm of the nocturne. It was a piece he had performed many times before, and despite the brokenness of the piano beneath his hands, he found comfort in the melody. The first few notes flowed easily, a gentle breeze of sound that calmed his nerves. But soon, the music began to shift, the more complex sections demanding his full attention. He could feel the tension in his body, the familiar tightening in his chest. It was as if the music itself was testing him, daring him to falter. And for a moment, he did. His fingers stumbled over a chord, and the sound echoed through the room, jarring and off-key. Elijah froze. He hated moments like this. Hated the feeling of being unsure, of not having control over the music that had always been his refuge. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. The notes, the rhythm, they were still there. They were just hiding, waiting for him to find them again. "You're not good enough." The words from Sebastian King echoed in his mind, cutting through the silence of the room. "Anyone can plunk at the keys. That doesn't make you a musician." Elijah flinched, the sting of Sebastian's words hitting him like a physical blow. But then, as if on instinct, he shook it off. "No. I'm not going to let him win. Not today." He repositioned his fingers, focused his mind, and played again. This time, the notes were clearer, more confident. He allowed himself to sink into the rhythm, trusting that the music would carry him through. Hours passed. The darkness outside the window deepened, but Elijah didn't notice. All he could hear was the sound of the piano, the rise and fall of the notes, the pulse of his heart matching the beat. The more he played, the more he felt the music take over, guide him, push him further. The complexities of the piece were no longer a challenge but a chance to show the world what he was capable of. By the time he returned to his hotel room, exhausted and soaked in sweat, he could feel the strain in his fingers, the sharp ache in his back. But there was a fire burning inside of him now, a determination he hadn't felt before. The doubts hadn't disappeared, they never did, but they were quieter now. Fainter. The next few days were filled with more rehearsals. Each time Elijah sat at the piano, the world outside seemed to fade a little more, until it was just him, the keys, and the music. He wasn't concerned with the competition anymore. He wasn't worried about who was watching or what they thought. He was there for one reason, and one reason only, to prove to himself that he could. But the world had a way of pulling him back into its expectations. As the competition drew nearer, Elijah found himself face to face with the harsh reality of what was to come. The rehearsals with the other contestants were nerve-wracking. Some were so polished, so precise. It was easy to feel like he didn't belong in that room. He was out of place, not just because of his blindness, but because of the way people looked at him. They saw him as an outsider. They saw him as an underdog. But it was in those moments, when the weight of the world felt too heavy to bear, that Elijah remembered the sound of his mother's voice. "Don't let them dim your light, Elijah." And that, more than anything, became his driving force. He wasn't going to let them make him feel small. He wasn't going to let anyone tell him what he could or couldn't do. He had a gift. And no one, not even Sebastian King, could take that away from him. The tension in the air was thick as the competition began. The other musicians were polished, prepared. But Elijah? He had something different, something deeper. He had the music. And he was ready to fight for it. The night before the competition, Elijah couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his hotel room, the sheets tangled around his legs as his mind raced. Every time he closed his eyes, the doubts came rushing back, filling the quiet space with the weight of his fears. He could still hear the echoes of Sebastian King's mocking words, the sounds of the audience's disinterest. It all felt so real, so suffocating. What if the judges didn't see him for who he really was? What if they dismissed him like everyone else? He sat up in bed, the moonlight casting a soft glow through the window. The city below was quiet, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. His fingers traced the edge of the blanket, feeling the smooth fabric under his touch. His mind wandered to the long hours of practice, the sweat, the frustration, the moments of triumph, and the moments of failure. He had put everything into this. But what if it's not enough? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft buzz of his phone on the nightstand. He reached for it, his fingers brushing over the smooth glass of the screen before he answered the call. "Elijah?" The voice on the other end was familiar, warm. It was Mama June. "How you doin', baby?" He smiled despite himself. "I'm okay, Mama. Just, can't sleep." She chuckled softly. "I can tell. The night before something big, huh?" "Yeah," Elijah replied, his voice quiet. "I'm just, worried." I figured." You always worry before the big things. But listen to me, Elijah. You've been doing this your whole life. You've been playing music before you even knew how to talk. Ain't nobody got a heart like yours. Don't let those other folks make you question that. Elijah squeezed his eyes shut, trying to hold back the sudden rush of emotion. But what if they don't get it, Mama? What if they look at me and just see a blind kid? What if they don't hear the music like I do? Mama June's voice softened, but there was no hesitation. They'll hear it, Elijah. You've got a way of speaking to people without saying a word. The music comes from your soul. It's what makes you different, baby. That's the gift you have. And you ain't gotta prove nothing to nobody. Just play for you. Elijah let out a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words sink in. He had heard it a million times before, but tonight, in the quiet of the hotel room, they felt more real than ever. The world would always have its doubts, but the music was his to own. Thanks, Mama, he whispered. I needed to hear that. I know, baby. You'll do just fine. You always do. They said their goodbyes, and Elijah hung up, feeling a strange calm wash over him. It wasn't the certainty he was looking for, but it was enough. He didn't need to have all the answers right now. All he needed to do was step onto that stage and trust in what he knew best, the music. The morning of the competition arrived with an unsettling stillness. Elijah woke early, his body still tired from a restless night, but there was something else stirring in him, a quiet sense of anticipation, the beginning of something unknown. He ran his fingers through his hair, a long, deliberate motion. As he dressed in a suit that had been meticulously chosen for him, dark gray, sharp, with a crisp white shirt, he tried not to think about the hundreds of people who would be watching. He focused instead on the simple act of preparing, of making himself ready. The competition would take place at a grand concert hall, the kind of place Elijah had only seen in photos, and even then, it had felt distant, out of reach. But now, it was right in front of him. The stage was set. The judges, renowned musicians and critics from all over the world, would be sitting there, evaluating every move, every note. He couldn't afford to stumble. But in the pit of his stomach, there was something else, curiosity. A strange feeling that the unknown wasn't something to be feared, but something to be embraced. The opportunity, the challenge, he had never felt so alive, so drawn to something larger than himself. The concert hall was massive, its walls adorned with gold leaf and intricate moldings that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the high ceilings. The stage, illuminated by soft spotlights, gleamed with anticipation. Elijah's footsteps were the only sound in the otherwise silent backstage area, the noise of the crowd muffled beyond the heavy curtains. He could feel the vibrations of the audience's murmurs, the shuffle of their shoes as they took their seats. He couldn't see them, but he could sense the weight of their gaze, heavy and pressing. He paused just before the curtain. The air around him felt thick with expectation, a moment suspended in time. Behind him, he could hear the faint sounds of another contestant warming up, the soft hum of a violin string being plucked. Elijah took a deep breath, closing his eyes for just a moment, feeling the rhythm of his own heartbeat. He thought of the music again, how it had always been the one constant in his life, the one thing that never let him down. He thought of Mama June's words, just play for you. He was ready. All right, Elijah. You're up, the stage manager's voice broke through his thoughts, and the curtain began to rise. Elijah stepped out onto the stage, feeling the warmth of the lights on his face. The audience was there, somewhere beyond the blinding light, but all he could focus on were the keys, the piano that awaited him at the center of the stage. As he walked toward it, the world around him seemed to fade. There was no audience. There were no judges. There was only him and the piano. He took a seat, his fingers hovering over the keys for a moment. He could feel the faint hum of the strings beneath the ivory surface, the vibrations that called to him. And then, with a deep breath, he began. The first notes were tentative, a soft beginning. The melody he chose was bold, not one that many would dare to attempt in such a high-stakes environment. But it was his. The notes wrapped around him, familiar yet new. Each chord was a reflection of his own journey, his struggles, his growth. As his hands moved with ease, the tension he had carried for so long began to melt away. The music, his music, flowed through him, igniting a fire inside. He played with purpose, his emotions pouring into each note, each phrase. The world around him seemed to dissolve as he sank deeper into the music. He felt his way through the piece, each movement of his hands, each shift of his weight bringing him closer to something greater than himself. He wasn't just playing for the judges anymore. He wasn't playing for the audience. He was playing for the boy he had once been, the boy who had dreamed of a stage like this, and for the man he was becoming. When he finally finished, the last note ringing in the air, the silence that followed was profound. The audience held their breath. And for a moment, Elijah wondered if the world outside of his music would ever truly notice him. But then, slowly, softly, it began. Applause. A light ripple at first, then a wave of sound that filled the room. Elijah sat still for a moment, unsure of what to do, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't see their faces, but he could feel their energy. It was real. And it was his. Elijah stood up from the piano, the weight of the moment crashing down on him. His hands shook slightly as he nodded to the audience, stepping away from the piano. He had done it. He had faced the unknown, embraced the fear, and played with everything he had. And now, there was no turning back. The world was waiting, and Elijah was ready to meet it. The applause that followed Elijah's performance echoed in his mind long after the final note had faded. His fingers still tingled from the piano's keys, the vibrations of the music still alive in his memory. But in the aftermath of his performance, as he stood up and walked off the stage, a sudden silence took over him. The rush of emotion that had filled him during the piece, the pride, the fear, the catharsis, had left him feeling almost empty. Like he was suspended in mid-air, waiting for something, anything, to pull him back to earth. He passed the stage manager, who gave him a pat on the back. "Great job, Elijah. You really nailed it up there." But it all felt distant now, as if he was floating outside of his own body. He'd done what he had to do, given everything he had to give, and now all he could do was wait. He walked down the hallway backstage, hearing the voices of the other contestants murmuring in the distance. Some were congratulating each other, others were nervously discussing their own performances. Elijah didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure if he even wanted to talk to anyone right now. A sharp voice cut through the air, unmistakable, carrying over the chatter of the others. Well, if it isn't the blind kid who thinks he's got what it takes." Elijah froze, his stomach tightening. It was Sebastian King. The famous pianist. The one who had laughed when Elijah first stepped onto the stage during the auditions, who had made it clear from the moment they met that he didn't belong here. "You must think you're special, huh?" Sebastian's voice dripped with mockery. "You can't even see the keys, and yet you think you can compete with real musicians. What a joke." Elijah turned slowly to face him, his heartbeat quickening. He had almost forgotten about Sebastian's words until now. And now, here they were again, crashing over him like a wave. Elijah started, his voice unsure. He could feel his palms sweat, his confidence from the stage beginning to slip away. Sebastian stepped closer, a cruel smile on his face. "What did you think? That you could play and somehow fool everyone into thinking you belong here? Maybe you'll get a sympathy vote or two. But deep down, you know you don't stand a chance." Elijah felt a surge of anger rise inside him. This wasn't about Sebastian. This was about his own doubts, his own fears, all the things he had been trying to push aside. And yet, here Sebastian was, putting them all back in the spotlight, making them impossible to ignore. But then, just as quickly as the anger had surged, something else took over. The music. The sound of it, the warmth of it. The feeling that had been his guide on that stage. It rushed back to him, and with it, a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't here to compete with Sebastian King or anyone else. He was here for the music. Elijah took a slow breath, forcing himself to steady his trembling hands. He was done being afraid. Done listening to the voices of doubt that wanted to hold him back. "I don't need your approval, Sebastian," Elijah said, his voice firm, though his heart still raced. "I'm here to play for myself. Not you. Not anyone else. Just me. And that's all that matters." Sebastian stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Elijah stood his ground, refusing to back down. For the first time since stepping into the competition, he felt a flicker of something that wasn't fear. It was strength. A strength that came from within, something that had been waiting for this moment to reveal itself. Sebastian's smile faltered, just for a second. Then, with a dismissive wave, he turned on his heel. "Whatever, kid. You'll find out soon enough that this world isn't kind to people like you." Elijah didn't watch him go. He couldn't afford to. Instead, he took another breath, his chest rising and falling with the effort of keeping himself centered. The world outside was full of challenges, of people who doubted him, of obstacles he didn't yet understand. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the music. What mattered was what he had inside. Later that evening, after all the performances were over and the audience had filed out, Elijah found himself sitting alone in a quiet corner of the competition hall. He had just finished his final rehearsal before the announcement of the winners. The others had dispersed to go home, their own nerves and triumphs keeping them occupied. But Elijah sat still, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest of the chair, feeling the echoes of his earlier performance still pulsing within him. The emotional high from playing on stage had faded, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. What if Sebastian was right? What if he wasn't good enough? What if his performance had been a fluke, a brief moment of brilliance that couldn't be replicated? Elijah? He turned at the sound of the voice, startled out of his thoughts. It was Carla, the coordinator from the symphony program. She was standing in the doorway, her face tired but kind. "Hey," she said softly, walking into the room and sitting down beside him. "I wanted to talk to you. I saw your performance today. And I think, you really gave it your all." Elijah shrugged, looking down at his hands. He couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze. It wasn't perfect. No, Carla agreed, but it wasn't supposed to be. What you did up there, she paused, choosing her words carefully, was something most musicians could never do. You didn't just play the notes. You made the audience feel something. Elijah finally looked up at her, surprised by her words. You really think that? Carla smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. I do. You have something unique, Elijah. Something that can't be taught. Something that can't be measured by a sheet of music or a blindfold. The way you play, your connection to the music, it's real. And that's why you're here. Elijah felt a lump form in his throat. He had been so focused on the fear, the doubt, that he had forgotten the most important thing of all. He wasn't here to compete with anyone else. He wasn't here to prove anything. He was here because he had something to give, something that came from within him. And that, Carla was telling him, was enough. I guess I just needed to hear that, Elijah said quietly. Carla patted him gently on the shoulder. You'll do great, Elijah. No matter what happens here, you've already won. As the evening wore on and the hall grew quiet, Elijah felt something shift inside him. The anxiety, the pressure, the self-doubt, those things still lingered, but now they seemed distant, like background noise that was no longer as loud as it had been before. His thoughts drifted back to the stage, to the performance, and to the feeling of the music flowing through him. It was a strange comfort, knowing that he had given everything he had in that moment. Whether he won or lost, whether the judges saw it or not, Elijah had done something far more important. He had played with his heart, and that was all that mattered. And for the first time since stepping onto this journey, Elijah felt a peace within himself. He had faced his fears. He had stared down the voices of doubt. And, in that moment, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The days that followed Elijah's performance felt like a blur of nerves and waiting. The final round of the competition was fast approaching, and Elijah had spent his time replaying the piece in his mind, trying to find ways to perfect it, to make it better. Every small flaw felt like a crack in the carefully crafted performance he delivered. But despite the nagging self-doubt, something inside of him had changed. He wasn't the same person who had stepped off that stage with shaking hands. It was the small things that made the difference. His conversations with Carla, the quiet moments spent listening to the murmurs of fellow contestants, even the simple act of picking up the phone to call Mama June, they all contributed to the shift in his mind. For the first time in a long while, Elijah wasn't looking for approval. He wasn't playing to impress anyone. He was playing because it was his truth, because the music had always been a part of him. But as the announcement of the winners drew closer, the tension in the air seemed to grow thicker. The competition was fierce. Contestants who had performed flawlessly were starting to get the attention of the judges. And then there was Sebastian King, the prodigy who had dominated every stage he'd ever set foot on. He was already being hailed as the favorite, and Elijah could feel the weight of his shadow looming over him. It would be easy to assume that Sebastian would walk away with the prize, to let the noise of the world tell him that Elijah was just a fleeting distraction, an anomaly in a sea of true talent. But Elijah refused to let himself believe that. No longer would he allow the doubts, both from others and from within himself, control him. The day before the winners would be announced, Elijah went for a walk in the city, the streets bustling with life as people hurried from place to place. The contrast between the chaotic world around him and the quiet stillness he had come to crave was stark. He stopped in front of a park bench and sat down, taking in the moment. His eyes were closed, and the sun bathed his face in warmth. It wasn't until he heard a voice calling his name that he opened his eyes. "Hey! Elijah!" He turned to see Carla approaching, her smile wide and bright despite the weariness in her eyes. She had been on her feet for days, coordinating every detail of the competition, but there was something about the way she carried herself that made it clear she cared deeply for the young man sitting before her. "Hey," Elijah said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You're still alive." Carla laughed, sitting beside him on the bench. "Barely. But I wanted to find you, Elijah. I've been meaning to talk to you." Elijah nodded, unsure of what she was going to say. "You've been quiet these last few days," Carla said, her voice softer than usual. "I've been watching you, and I see something in you that the others don't." Elijah's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Carla continued, her gaze never leaving him, "you've got more than just talent. You've got heart. I don't know if you realize it, but it's what makes you stand out. Your music isn't just notes and rhythms, it's raw, it's honest, and it speaks to people in a way that perfection can't." Elijah swallowed hard, trying to process her words. He had always known that his music was different, but hearing it from someone else, someone who had witnessed the best of the best in action, made the reality of it all more tangible. "I didn't think I was good enough," Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought maybe I was just some mistake in the system. That I didn't belong here." Carla placed a hand on his shoulder, a gentle reassurance. "Elijah, you belong here more than anyone. You've got something that the world needs to hear. And I know that no matter what happens tomorrow, this experience, this journey, it's only the beginning for you." A lump formed in Elijah's throat as he looked at her. The weight of her words felt heavier than any performance, more significant than any contest. He had spent so much time wondering if he belonged, if he could measure up to the other performers, to Sebastian King, but now he understood. It wasn't about proving his worth. It wasn't about winning. It was about sharing his truth, his voice, through the music. That was enough. The next day, the competition hall was filled with anticipation. The finalists had gathered, waiting for the moment when the judges would announce the winners. The room was tense with the kind of nervous energy that could only come from hours of hard work and sacrifice. Elijah sat in the waiting area, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his fingers curling slightly, as if seeking comfort from the familiar pressure. He wasn't nervous. Not in the way he thought he would be. Instead, a quiet peace had settled over him. He had done his best. The rest was out of his hands. As the judges finally stepped onto the stage, the silence in the room grew thick. The host's voice echoed throughout the hall, calling each finalist up to stand at the front, waiting for their fate. One by one, the names of the other contestants were called. And then, finally, it was Elijah's turn. "Elijah Williams," the host announced, his voice booming, "please come forward." Elijah stood slowly, the sound of his shoes tapping against the floor echoing in the vast room. He wasn't afraid, but there was still a weight in his chest. He stepped into the spotlight, the audience's eyes on him, but he couldn't hear their whispers anymore. He wasn't worried about them. The head judge, a well-known conductor named Graham Linton, looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "Elijah, your performance was one of the most emotional and raw we've seen in this competition. You played with an honesty that most musicians only dream of achieving. But more importantly, you made us feel. And that is something that cannot be taught." The words seemed to hang in the air, like a weight lifting from Elijah's shoulders. He wasn't sure if he was imagining it, but he could almost hear Mama June's voice in his head, telling him to trust in the music, to trust in himself. I don't know what to say," Elijah stammered, his voice shaking slightly. "I just wanted to play for me. I didn't expect to be here. I didn't expect any of this." Linton smiled, his eyes kind but firm. "That's the beauty of it. You didn't expect it. But you earned it. We see a future for you in music, Elijah. A future that isn't defined by what others think of you, but by your own heart, your own passion." Elijah blinked, feeling a tear slip down his cheek before he could stop it. For the first time in his life, he felt like he wasn't just a part of the world, he was part of something bigger than himself. His music was a bridge, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. And in this moment, he knew that he was no longer that boy who had been afraid to take the stage. He was a musician. And that was enough. The judge's final announcement was a blur, but the important part was clear. Elijah Williams wasn't just another contestant. He was a winner. And not just of the competition, but of something far more significant, the understanding that the music he had always played for himself was more than enough for the world. As the applause thundered in his ears, Elijah stood tall. The road ahead would be long, filled with challenges and doubts, but for now, for this moment, he could let himself believe that he had truly found his place. And that was a victory greater than any prize. The sound of applause still echoed in Elijah's ears as he stepped off the stage, clutching the small trophy that represented something far greater than a competition victory. It was the recognition of his perseverance, his passion, and the music that had always been his sanctuary. But as he walked down the hallway of the competition venue, something gnawed at him, an undercurrent of uncertainty he hadn't anticipated. For the first time in weeks, Elijah didn't feel the rush of triumph. Instead, there was a weight settling over him. The trophy in his hand felt heavy, its significance sinking in with each step. Yes, he had won, but now what? He had spent so long focusing on the competition, on proving himself to the world, that the reality of winning felt almost anticlimactic. He had given everything to get here, but as he glanced at the sparkling trophy, he realized that it wasn't about the title or the recognition anymore. It was about something deeper, something more profound. The quiet hum of the backstage environment enveloped him, a stark contrast to the deafening applause from just moments ago. It was as if the world had paused, waiting for him to understand the next step. Elijah. He turned to see Carla approaching him, her face glowing with pride. There was no mistaking the warmth in her eyes as she came to stand beside him. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "You really did it." Elijah smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I did," he murmured, still turning the trophy over in his hands. "But I don't know if I feel the way I thought I would." Carla studied him for a moment before nodding, as if understanding exactly what he meant. "I get it," she said, gently nudging him with her shoulder. "Winning a competition isn't going to solve everything. It won't fix all your doubts, and it won't take away the fear of the unknown. But it's a sign of something much more important: you've found your voice. And now, you get to decide what comes next." Elijah's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "I don't even know what that looks like. Where do I go from here?" Carla smiled, a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. "You've already taken the hardest step, Elijah. You've faced your fears, you've played with your heart, and now you get to share that with the world. You've got a gift, and there are people out there who need to hear it." Elijah thought about her words as he looked down at the trophy once more. This isn't the end. It was just the beginning of a journey he had never fully imagined for himself, a journey that went beyond the stage and the applause, beyond the validation of a competition. As he stood there, surrounded by the buzz of the competition winding down, he knew that what mattered most now was the music. The music that had been his constant companion, the only thing that had ever made him feel whole. And that was what he needed to focus on. Later that evening, after the event had wrapped up and the final congratulations had been exchanged, Elijah found himself alone in his hotel room. The lights of the city outside his window twinkled in the darkness, a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. He sat at the desk, his fingers idly tapping on the wooden surface, as if trying to find a rhythm, a familiar melody to ground him. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Mama June. He smiled as he read her words, "Elijah, I'm so proud of you, baby. I knew you had it in you. You've come so far, and this is just the beginning. Keep playing with your heart, and the world will see you for the amazing musician you are. Love you, always. Mama June." A warmth spread through him as he reread her message, the weight of her love and support sinking deep into his chest. Mama June had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. She had never treated him like a boy with a disability or someone who needed to be protected. She had always treated him like Elijah, the person, the artist. And that belief had been the foundation of everything that had pushed him forward. It was then that Elijah realized something important. He had been so focused on proving something to others that he had almost forgotten why he started playing the piano in the first place. He had played for himself. He had played for the joy, the expression, the release of emotions that words could never fully capture. And now, in the quiet of his room, with the competition behind him, Elijah knew that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. He didn't need to chase validation or titles. He only needed to continue being true to the music. The next day, Elijah sat on the edge of his bed, still in the silence of his hotel room, as he thought about what Carla had said. It was time to make a decision. The trophy was just a small part of his journey. The future lay ahead, and it was up to him to decide what path to take. He could go back home, return to his old life with Mama June and his friends. He could take the safer route, the familiar route. It would be easy to do that, comfortable, even. But something deep inside him pulled in a different direction. The world of music had opened its doors to him in a way that he had never expected. The opportunities were limitless, but it would require him to take risks, risks that would push him beyond his comfort zone, beyond what he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about performing on stage anymore. It was about creating, about sharing his music with the world in ways he had never thought possible. Elijah took a deep breath and reached for his phone. He dialed the number he had been holding off on calling for days. "Hello," a familiar voice answered. Mama June, Elijah said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I want to talk to you about something. Later that afternoon, Elijah sat down with Carla and the judges of the competition for a final debrief. There, amidst the congratulations and praise, they spoke about the future. They spoke about programs that could help him develop his skills, opportunities to travel and collaborate with other musicians, and ways to amplify his voice in the music world. It wasn't just about playing well. It was about what came after, how he could continue to build on this experience and share his gift with the world. Elijah, you have something special, Graham Linton, the head judge, told him as they wrapped up. This competition was just the beginning of your journey. Whatever you decide to do, know that the doors will always be open for you. That evening, Elijah stood in front of the mirror, the trophy still resting on his dresser. He had come so far, farther than he had ever thought possible. But this was just the beginning of his journey. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with more doubts and hurdles, but he felt ready. For the first time, he wasn't afraid. He had found his voice, and no one could take that from him. As he looked into the mirror, Elijah whispered softly to himself, I'm ready. And with that, he knew that the world was waiting for him. His music was ready to be shared. His journey had just begun. The weeks following Elijah's victory in the competition were a whirlwind of activity. Calls, emails, and meetings filled his days, each one an opportunity that both excited and terrified him. It was hard to believe how quickly his life had changed, how quickly everything around him had begun to shift. The trophy, once a symbol of his unexpected success, now felt like a weight, reminding him of the responsibility he had to himself and to the music. Elijah had always dreamed of being a musician, but he had never truly believed that his dream would be within reach. Now, with the doors to the music world swinging wide open, he had to figure out how to step through them. Every decision he made felt monumental. Every choice seemed like it would shape the rest of his life. Sitting in a small cafe in downtown New York City, Elijah scrolled through the latest emails from managers, producers, and agencies. There were offers for collaborations, opportunities to record his own music, and even potential performance dates with renowned orchestras. The possibilities were endless, but each one felt like a leap into the unknown. Got a minute? Elijah looked up from his phone to see Carla standing in front of him, a cup of coffee in her hand. She was dressed in her usual style. Casual but put together. There was something calming about her presence, something steady that Elijah had come to rely on since meeting her during the competition. Of course, Elijah replied, setting his phone down. What's up? Carla slid into the chair across from him and placed her coffee on the table. I've been thinking about you, she said, her tone thoughtful. I know it's overwhelming, all these offers coming your way. But I want you to take a deep breath. This is your moment, Elijah. But it's also the beginning of a much bigger journey. You've got to make sure you're ready for it. Elijah smiled, though it was more of a nervous twitch than a genuine grin. I don't even know if I am, he confessed. It's all happening so fast. And I feel like I don't even know where to start. Carla took a sip of her coffee, her gaze steady on him. The first step is figuring out what you want. Not what the agents, or the managers, or anyone else wants from you. This is your journey. Take some time to think about what matters to you. Elijah nodded slowly. Carla was right. He had been so focused on taking advantage of every opportunity that he hadn't stopped to think about what he actually wanted from all of this. He had been trying to fit into a mold that others had created for him. It was time to make his own. The next few days were a blur of reflection and quiet moments alone. Elijah spent long hours at the piano, playing without a goal, letting the music speak to him rather than the expectations of the outside world. He realized that, while the offers and the opportunities were tempting, none of them felt entirely right. None of them captured the essence of who he was and what he wanted to achieve with his music. He thought about the journey that had led him here, the late nights spent practicing in Mama June's living room, the moments of self-doubt, the fierce desire to prove himself. He thought about the way music had always been his refuge, the way it had given him purpose when nothing else had. The world might have been waiting for him, but it was time to stop waiting for permission. Elijah knew he needed to carve his own path. It was then that he decided. The next day, he called Carla and asked if they could meet. The decision was made, and he knew what he had to do next. Carla arrived at the cafe with a look of curiosity on her face, but Elijah could see the understanding in her eyes. She had known him long enough to sense when he was about to make a big decision. "Elijah," she said, taking a seat across from him. "What's going on?" Elijah took a deep breath, his fingers tapping against the table nervously. "I've been thinking," he began. "I've been so focused on what everyone else thinks I should do, record a hit album, go on tour, sign with a big label. But none of that feels like me. None of it feels like what I want for myself." Carla's eyebrows arched slightly, and she nodded in encouragement. "I'm listening. I want to create music that matters to me, that reflects who I really am. Not just what people expect from me, or what I think I should be doing to make it. I want to tell my story through my music, not just through a performance or a competition. I want to connect with people on a deeper level." Carla's expression softened as she leaned forward. "I knew you were going to say that," she said, her voice full of warmth. "It's what I've been hoping you'd realize. You've always had something special, Elijah, and I think it's time you stop hiding behind the spotlight and let your music shine in the way that only you can." Elijah smiled, feeling the weight of her words sink deep into him. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity, a sense of peace. He had been so caught up in proving himself to the world that he had forgotten to ask himself what kind of musician he wanted to be. And now, the answer was clear. "I want to create music for the soul," he said softly. "I want to connect with people who feel what I feel, who understand what I'm trying to say. It might not be the safe route, but it's the one that feels right for me." Carla's smile grew wider, and she placed a hand on his. "I'm proud of you, Elijah. This is the start of something incredible. And I'm here for it, every step of the way." The decision was made. Elijah declined the offers that didn't align with his vision. He turned down the record deals, the contracts, the tours that others had pushed him toward. Instead, he began working on his own project, one that was entirely his own. He found a small recording studio where he could collaborate with musicians who shared his passion for authentic, heartfelt music. He would record songs that spoke to the human experience, the joy, the pain, the love, and the longing. He wanted his music to be a reflection of his journey, his struggles, and his triumphs. It would be raw, unfiltered, and true to who he was. But there was one thing he needed before he could begin. He needed to go home. After weeks of being away, Elijah returned to the small town where he had grown up. The familiar streets, the neighborhood parks, the people who had always supported him, it felt like stepping back into the embrace of his roots. He went to Mama June's house first, the place where he had started everything, where his musical journey had been born. She greeted him with open arms, as always. "You look different," she said with a knowing smile. "Like you figured something out." Elijah grinned. "I think I have." As they sat down for a quiet dinner, Elijah shared his decision with Mama June. He told her about the path he wanted to take, the music he wanted to create. And as always, she supported him without hesitation. "I'm proud of you, Elijah," she said, her voice steady and full of love. "You've always been destined for greatness, but this is you taking control of your own story." Elijah smiled, feeling the weight of her words wrap around him like a warm blanket. For the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the unknown. He was ready to embrace it. And so, with his family's blessing, Elijah set out on the next chapter of his journey, one that would take him to places he had never imagined, but that he knew would be the truest expression of who he was. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but he was no longer afraid to take that leap into the unknown. This was his moment. And it had only just begun. The decision to step away from the traditional route of fame and recognition was liberating, but Elijah knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. With every call he made to reject offers, he could feel the weight of uncertainty growing heavier on his shoulders. These were opportunities that most musicians would dream of, but they didn't align with the vision he had for his music. His heart told him he was making the right choice, but the fear of what came next still lingered. Days turned into weeks, and Elijah settled into his new rhythm. He spent long hours at the recording studio, collaborating with local musicians who shared his vision of authentic, heartfelt music. It wasn't glamorous. There were no lights, no cameras, no crowds, just the raw sound of creativity in motion. For the first time in his life, Elijah felt the freedom to experiment, to make mistakes, and to truly own his artistry. But there were moments when doubt crept in. The world outside the studio seemed so much bigger than his small corner of it. He saw social media posts from former competitors, now signing major contracts, performing at sold-out venues, living the life he had once thought he wanted. He couldn't help but wonder if he had made a mistake. One evening, after another long day in the studio, Elijah stood by the window in his small apartment, watching the city below. The lights flickered in the distance, and he could hear the faint hum of traffic in the background. His phone buzzed on the counter, snapping him out of his reverie. It was a message from Carla. "I've been thinking about you. You doing okay? I know you've been quiet lately. Don't let the silence fool you. Your journey is still unfolding." Elijah smiled as he read her message. She always knew how to cut through the noise and remind him of what truly mattered. He had been so focused on the fear of what he had left behind, that he hadn't taken the time to appreciate the space he was creating for himself. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And it was his. He quickly typed a response, "I'm figuring it out. It's tough, but it's right." Carla's reply came almost instantly, "That's all anyone can ask for, Elijah. You're doing great. Keep at it." With a sense of calm, Elijah set his phone down and turned back toward the window. This was his time. No, it wouldn't be easy. Yes, it would be messy. But it was his truth, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a deep sense of peace about that. Over the next few months, Elijah's days fell into a rhythm. He continued to work on his music, refining his sound, his voice, and his vision. He collaborated with different artists, some seasoned, some new, and slowly, his own sound began to take shape. His music wasn't just about technical ability, it was about emotion, storytelling, and connection. He wasn't just a pianist anymore, he was a storyteller, a creator of worlds. Each piece he composed was a reflection of his inner journey, his struggles, and his victories. But success in this realm looked different. There were no charts to track his progress, no immediate applause to measure his impact. Instead, Elijah found fulfillment in the slow, steady growth of his music, in the messages and emails from fans who resonated with what he was creating. It wasn't about the numbers or the accolades, it was about the connections, the hearts he was touching along the way. One evening, after a particularly long recording session, Elijah received an invitation that made his heart race. A small, local theater was hosting a live showcase of up-and-coming musicians, and they wanted him to perform. The offer wasn't as grand as the tours and contracts he had turned down, but it was a sign that people were starting to take notice. It wasn't just about being seen in the spotlight anymore, it was about being seen for what he truly had to offer. Elijah hesitated. A part of him wanted to run back to the comfort of anonymity, where no one could judge him or his work. But another part of him knew that this was exactly what he needed. It was the next step, a small but significant one, toward sharing his voice with the world. With a deep breath, he hit accept on the invitation. The night of the showcase arrived, and Elijah stood backstage, feeling the familiar flutter of nerves in his stomach. The small theater was packed, the atmosphere buzzing with anticipation. As he stood behind the velvet curtains, he could hear the sound of applause and chatter from the audience. He was just one of many artists scheduled to perform that evening, but it didn't feel that way. To him, this was his moment, his chance to connect with an audience that could truly understand him. He walked out onto the stage, the spotlight immediately casting a harsh glow on him. The room fell silent as the audience waited for him to begin. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, judging, evaluating. The pressure was immense, but he embraced it. This was the moment he had been working for, no, this was the moment he had been becoming. Elijah took a seat at the grand piano, his fingers brushing the keys lightly before settling into position. The first notes filled the air, a soft melody that grew in intensity with each chord. His music was no longer just about skill, it was about feeling. He poured his soul into every note, letting the music tell the story that words never could. The audience sat in complete silence as Elijah played, absorbed by the raw emotion in his performance. This wasn't just a recital, this was his truth laid bare, shared with anyone willing to listen. When the final note echoed through the theater, Elijah sat back, his breath heavy but satisfied. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the audience erupted into applause, a sound that seemed to shake the very walls of the room. Elijah's heart raced as he stood, bowing humbly, not knowing what the future would hold, but knowing that in that moment, he had done exactly what he had set out to do, connect. Backstage, as the other artists congratulated him on his performance, Elijah felt a wave of emotion wash over him. This wasn't about the applause, or the recognition, it was about the people who had felt his music, who had experienced the same raw emotions he had poured into every note. For the first time, Elijah understood what Carla had meant when she said he had to decide what was truly important. It wasn't fame. It wasn't fortune. It was connection. As he walked out into the cool night air, his phone buzzed with a message from Mama June. "I knew you had it in you, Elijah. Keep playing your heart out. We're all so proud of you. You're doing what you were always meant to do." A smile spread across his face as he read her words. Elijah was no longer the boy who had been afraid of the unknown. He was a musician, an artist, and this was only the beginning of his journey. Days later, Elijah received another email, this time from a major record label. They had heard his performance at the showcase and were interested in working with him. The offer was a promising one, with the kind of opportunities he had once dreamed of. But as Elijah read through the details, he didn't feel the rush he had expected. Instead, he felt the same calm that had washed over him the night of his performance. He didn't need to make a decision based on what others expected of him. He already knew where he was going. He hit decline. He wasn't ready to compromise his voice for the sake of someone else's vision. His journey was his own to make. Elijah walked away from that decision with confidence, knowing that the road he was on wasn't the easiest, but it was the one that truly resonated with his soul. He was no longer just chasing a dream. He was living it, step by step, note by note. This was only the beginning. The road less traveled wasn't easy, but it was his. And that was all that mattered. The weeks following Elijah's decision to pursue a path of authenticity were filled with a mix of exhilaration and uncertainty. Every day was a fresh challenge, a new opportunity to define what his music could be without the constraints of the commercial world. He spent most of his time in the studio, experimenting with sounds, collaborating with other artists, and refining his craft. Despite the lack of mainstream recognition, Elijah felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He was building something real, something that came from his heart. But the road Elijah had chosen wasn't always smooth. At times, he found himself questioning whether he was on the right path. Doubt crept in during the quiet moments, those hours when no one was listening, when the studio was empty, and the future seemed uncertain. Elijah had always been a dreamer, but now he had to contend with the practicalities of building a career in music without the infrastructure and support of a big label. How long would he be able to sustain this? Would anyone outside his circle ever truly hear what he had to offer? One crisp autumn evening, after another long recording session, Elijah decided to take a walk through the city. He needed space to clear his mind. The streets of New York City were alive with energy as people hurried by, wrapped in scarves and coats, the hum of city life ringing in the air. The city felt like it was pulsing with possibility, yet there was something isolating about it. The noise of the world could drown out the quiet voice inside. As he walked, his thoughts wandered to the future. He knew his music had touched a few people, but what about the masses? Could he make a real impact without compromising who he was? Lost in thought, Elijah didn't see the man standing on the corner until he nearly bumped into him. He looked up, startled, to find himself face to face with a figure that seemed out of place in the city's hustle and bustle. The man was older, in his late 50s, wearing a tailored coat that was clearly of high quality, yet he had an air of unpretentiousness about him. His hair was salt and pepper, his eyes sharp, and his expression thoughtful. He held a violin case in one hand, and his posture suggested someone who had been around the world, seen its beauty and its pain. "Sorry about that," Elijah said, taking a step back. "I wasn't looking where I was going." The man gave a half-smile. "No harm done. Sometimes the world has a way of knocking us off our path, doesn't it?" Elijah blinked, surprised by the stranger's words. There was something oddly profound about them, something that resonated with him. "I guess so," Elijah replied, a little uncertain. "I've been trying to figure out my own path lately." The man's eyes seemed to light up. "Funny," he said, "because that's exactly what I've been trying to do for a long time. Sometimes, it takes a detour to get to where we're meant to be." Elijah raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You sound like you've been through a few detours." The man chuckled softly. "You could say that. My name's Victor, by the way. I'm a musician, though I don't play much these days." Elijah extended his hand. "Elijah. I'm a pianist." Victor's eyes twinkled. "A pianist, eh? You're in the right city for that. But tell me, Elijah, what kind of music do you play?" Elijah hesitated for a moment, unsure how to explain the journey he was on. "I'm trying to make something real," he said slowly. "Something that speaks to people, not just to sell records. I want to create music that connects, not just for the sake of fame or money. It's not the easiest path, but I think it's the right one for me." Victor studied him for a moment, as if weighing his words. "It's the hardest path, young man. But also the most rewarding. You know, I walked that road myself once. I used to perform in front of packed concert halls, surrounded by adoring fans and record deals that made promises of fame and fortune. But after a while, I realized something. I wasn't playing for me anymore. I was playing for them, what they wanted to hear, not what I needed to express." Elijah's mind whirled. This man, this stranger, seemed to understand exactly what he was going through, even though they had only just met. "So what did you do?" Elijah asked. Victor smiled knowingly. "I walked away. Left the stages, the fame, and all the promises behind. I started playing for myself again. Music became my refuge once more. But it's a lonely road, Elijah. There are nights when you wonder if anyone will hear your music, or if anyone will care." Elijah nodded, feeling a deep sense of connection with the older man. "I get that. I've been wondering the same thing myself." Victor's expression softened. "Don't let the silence scare you. It's in the silence that the real music begins. When you stop playing for the applause and start playing for yourself, that's when you find your true voice." Elijah felt a weight lift from his chest as Victor's words sank in. There was something in his tone, something wise and reassuring, that gave Elijah the courage he had been searching for. The silence didn't have to be a sign of failure, it could be a sign of growth, of finding something deeper. "I think I needed to hear that," Elijah said quietly. "I've been so focused on what's not happening that I forgot to appreciate what is." Victor nodded, his face serious but kind. "Remember, music is not a competition. It's a journey. And sometimes, the beauty is in the waiting. Elijah smiled, a deep sense of gratitude filling him. Thank you, Victor. I'll remember that. Victor's gaze lingered on Elijah for a moment before he began to walk away, his violin case resting casually by his side. As he turned the corner, he called back over his shoulder. Keep playing, Elijah. And don't be afraid of the silence. That's where the magic happens. Elijah stood there for a long moment, watching the man disappear into the night. A sense of clarity washed over him. He realized that his journey wasn't just about the music, it was about the connection to his own truth, and the courage to stay true to that. The world might not have been ready for his music yet, but that didn't mean he was failing. It meant he was building something real, something that would resonate in its own time. A few days later, Elijah returned to the studio with renewed energy. He had started to see his path more clearly. The silence he had feared wasn't something to avoid. It was something to embrace. It was in the silence that the most powerful compositions took form. He poured his heart into his music, not concerned with how fast it was reaching the world, but with how true it was to himself. He had made the decision to share his music, but not to seek fame or approval. He wanted to offer something meaningful to those who needed it, those who would find solace in his melodies, just as he had once found solace in the music of others. The road ahead would still be long, but Elijah was no longer afraid of the unknown. He had learned, through his encounter with Victor, that the journey itself was the reward. And so, with renewed purpose, Elijah continued down the road less traveled, a road that was, he now realized, the only one that could truly lead him home. It had been a few weeks since Elijah's unexpected encounter with Victor. The wisdom shared by the older man had been echoing in his mind ever since. The silence is where the magic happens, Victor had said. It was a lesson Elijah clung to in the quietest moments, especially when doubt crept in. The music he was creating was still unknown, and the lack of recognition from the wider world sometimes felt like an overwhelming weight. But, there was something different now. Instead of fearing the silence, Elijah was starting to see it as a canvas, a space where his soul could paint freely without the pressure of an audience waiting for the next note. In the meantime, Elijah's relationships with his small circle of fellow musicians and friends had deepened. The small studio he had set up in his apartment had become a refuge, a place where he could explore sounds and ideas without judgment. It was a sanctuary of sorts, built on trust, authenticity, and shared passion. Slowly, he began to build a community around him, people who believed in him and in the music that was slowly taking shape. Despite the growing sense of purpose, Elijah had to face one undeniable fact: making a living as an independent artist was difficult. The rent was due. The bills were piling up. And while the music was something he couldn't stop making, there was still the question of how to keep afloat financially. Elijah had always been driven by his passion for music, but reality was hard to ignore. One afternoon, while Elijah was taking a much-needed break from recording, his phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, expecting a message from Carla or his mom, but instead, it was an unfamiliar number. Tentatively, he opened the message. "Hi Elijah, I'm Sarah, a producer at Rising Stars Media. We came across your music recently and were really impressed. We'd love to talk to you about a potential collaboration. Let us know if you're interested." Elijah blinked, staring at the screen in disbelief. The message seemed too good to be true. Rising Stars Media was a growing media company known for working with independent artists, helping them gain exposure while still maintaining artistic control. He had heard of them, but never imagined they would take an interest in him. After all, he hadn't been seeking any kind of commercial deal, he was focused on building something real, something that came from within. But this felt different. The offer seemed to respect his artistic vision. Taking a deep breath, he quickly typed back. "Hi Sarah, thank you so much for reaching out. I'd love to hear more about the opportunity. Let me know when's a good time to chat." Within minutes, Sarah replied, suggesting a time later that afternoon. Elijah set down his phone and walked to the window, the weight of the decision ahead settling on his shoulders. He had made it this far without compromise, but this could be the opportunity he had been waiting for. The practical part of him, the part that still needed to pay rent, was tempted. But the artist in him, the one who had turned down a big label deal to stay true to his voice, felt the pull of caution. Could this be the right collaboration? Would it align with his values, or would it push him further into the commercial world he had been trying to escape? The phone call with Sarah later that day was as cordial as it was enlightening. She explained the concept of their collaboration in detail. Rising Stars Media was looking to bring unique, authentic music to a larger audience, and they had an interest in working with Elijah. The idea was simple but appealing. He would create his music as he always had, and they would help promote it, through social media, small but meaningful performance opportunities, and connections to influential music bloggers. The company emphasized that they weren't interested in turning him into a mainstream commodity, they wanted to preserve his voice while helping him reach a wider audience. It sounded almost too perfect, too aligned with his vision. Elijah felt himself growing more and more intrigued as Sarah explained how they would handle the logistics, how they would support him financially, but also leave him the freedom to keep doing what he loved. At the end of the call, Sarah asked, "What do you think, Elijah? Does this sound like something you'd be interested in pursuing?" Elijah paused for a moment, weighing the options in his mind. The decision felt monumental, like it could be a turning point. He could accept the offer, secure his future, and begin to build a more substantial career. Or he could continue as he had, relying solely on his small circle, accepting the challenges but keeping the pure essence of his art. "I'm interested," Elijah said finally, the words feeling both thrilling and terrifying. "But I want to make sure we're on the same page. I've been down the road of big labels before, and I don't want to lose control of my music. My goal is to stay true to my vision." "Absolutely," Sarah responded warmly. "We want to work with you, not change you. Let's set up a meeting to go over the details and make sure this is the right fit." As Elijah hung up the phone, he felt a rush of conflicting emotions. There was excitement, yes, but there was also a deep sense of responsibility. Was he truly ready to take this next step? Was this the right balance between staying true to his art and moving forward in his career? The next few days were a whirlwind. Elijah met with Sarah and a few members of the Rising Stars team. He liked what he saw, passionate people who genuinely cared about their artists. They offered him a contract that seemed fair, with enough room for him to grow as an independent artist. They respected his autonomy and promised not to push him toward the mainstream sound he had rejected. It was, for all intents and purposes, the kind of partnership he had been waiting for. Still, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He had been burned before by promises that seemed too good to be true, and even though he liked Sarah and the team, he couldn't ignore the skepticism that lingered. It was his future at stake, after all. "I'll need some time to think it over," Elijah said after the meeting. Sarah nodded, understanding. "Of course. We'll give you all the time you need. This is your decision, and we want it to be the right one for you." That evening, Elijah walked through Central Park to clear his mind. The city around him was as alive as ever, but in that moment, everything seemed distant. He sat on a bench beneath the stars, alone with his thoughts. He could hear the sounds of distant traffic and the rustling of leaves in the wind, but in his heart, there was silence. The kind of silence that allowed for clarity. He thought about everything he had been through, the struggles, the doubts, the long nights in the studio, the rejection, the lonely moments. But he also thought about the music. The melodies, the emotions, the way it made him feel whole. The connection he had to the music was something no contract could take away. He had fought so hard to stay true to that. And yet, there was hope now. Hope that, with the right partnership, his music could reach people in ways it never had before. As the first light of dawn crept into the sky, Elijah knew what he had to do. He wasn't ready to compromise his vision, but this partnership could help him share his music with the world in a way that still honored his truth. He took a deep breath and made the call. "Hi Sarah," Elijah said when she picked up. "I've thought about it, and I'm in. Let's do this." He could hear the smile in her voice. "That's wonderful, Elijah. We're thrilled to work with you. Let's make this happen." Elijah smiled, his heart full. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of possibility. This was the beginning of something new. The road ahead wasn't the one he had expected, but maybe, just maybe, it was the one he was meant to travel. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The following weeks were a blur for Elijah. The decision to partner with Rising Stars Media had brought a mix of exhilaration and nerves. He'd signed the contract with the understanding that his artistic integrity would be respected, but now that the ink had dried, the real work was about to begin. There were meetings to attend, emails to respond to, and plans to be made. The world he had stepped into was different from the solitary, creative space he had known, and the shift was both exciting and intimidating. Elijah had always worked best when he could lose himself in the music. He was used to working in the quiet of his studio, his fingers dancing over the keys, his heart spilling into every note. But now, he was entering a world that demanded more than just creativity, it demanded strategy, planning, and performance. It wasn't just about making beautiful music anymore, it was about making it seen and heard. The pressure was starting to mount, but Elijah was determined to stay grounded. The first major task was to finalize his upcoming single. Rising Stars Media was keen on getting something out to the public, to start building momentum. Elijah had a rough idea of what he wanted, but now it had to be refined, perfected. He had a deep, haunting melody that had been floating in his head for months, but he hadn't quite found the right way to express it. The pressure to turn it into something that would catch people's attention weighed on him, but he pushed those thoughts aside. The music came first, always. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Elijah sat in his studio, alone. The lights were dim, and the room felt both intimate and expansive, as if the walls could stretch to encompass every feeling, every thought, every melody that had yet to be played. His fingers hovered over the piano keys. He wasn't sure if he was ready to give the world this part of himself, but the music was there. It had to come out. He pressed the first key, and then another, and another. Slowly, the melody started to form. It was melancholy, yet hopeful, a reflection of the turmoil and the hope that had lived inside him all these months. It spoke of longing, longing for connection, for understanding, for something beyond the noise of the world. It was personal, raw, and real. The music began to flow, and Elijah lost himself in it. For the first time in weeks, he forgot about the label, the pressure, the expectations. It was just him, the piano, and the song. The melody built and built, each note a step forward, each chord a realization of something he had been trying to express for so long. This was his truth, and it needed to be heard. By the time the sun began to rise, Elijah had finished the song. He sat back in his chair, staring at the empty room, the weight of what he had just created sinking in. The music felt like a piece of his soul, like he had peeled back a layer of himself and shared it with the world. It was beautiful, raw, and imperfect, but it was his. And that was all that mattered. The next day, he sent the track to Sarah and the team at Rising Stars Media. He was nervous, more nervous than he had been in a long time. This wasn't just another song. This was his vulnerability, wrapped in melody and harmony, ready to be shared with the world. He waited, tapping his fingers against his desk, his mind racing with questions. Would they like it? Would they think it was too raw, too personal, too much of a risk? The email reply came the next afternoon, and Elijah's heart skipped a beat as he opened it. Elijah, we just listened to the track, and we are absolutely blown away. This is the kind of music we want to share with the world. It's bold, it's real, and it speaks to something deeper. Let's get this out as soon as possible. We'll work on the release strategy and start the promotion. You've got something special here. Elijah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. There was a rush of relief, a burst of pride, and a deep sense of gratitude. He had done it. He had created something he believed in, and it was being recognized for what it was. The validation wasn't just from the label, it was from the knowledge that he had stayed true to his vision, even when the pressure was overwhelming. In the following weeks, the momentum began to build. Rising Stars Media launched a promotional campaign, teasing the release of Elijah's single through social media posts, email blasts, and blog write-ups. The message was clear: this was a new artist, an artist who wasn't afraid to be vulnerable and authentic in a world that often prized polish over substance. The song was released on all major streaming platforms, and Elijah's phone began to light up with notifications. His friends, family, and a growing list of fans started to share the track, expressing how much it resonated with them. The comments were overwhelmingly positive, and for the first time in a long time, Elijah began to see the fruits of his labor, not in the form of fame or wealth, but in something far more meaningful: connection. His music was reaching people, touching hearts, and sparking emotions in ways he had always hoped for. But there was still a long road ahead. Elijah knew that the release of the single was just the beginning. He couldn't rest on his laurels. There would be more songs, more performances, more challenges, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. He wasn't chasing after recognition or success for its own sake. He was creating art that mattered, and he had found a team that believed in it. As the days passed, Elijah felt the weight of his decision to partner with Rising Stars Media lifting from his shoulders. The pressure to compromise his vision had faded. Instead, he found himself surrounded by people who respected his art and were committed to helping him share it with the world in a way that honored its true essence. One evening, after a long day of meetings and phone calls, Elijah sat down in his favorite corner of the studio. He closed his eyes, letting the soft hum of the city outside filter through the walls. The world was still loud, full of distractions and noise, but for the first time in a long time, Elijah felt at peace. He picked up his guitar, the one that had traveled with him through so many years of uncertainty, and strummed a few chords. He wasn't trying to write anything new, he was simply enjoying the sound, the music, the feeling of being grounded in the present. The simplicity of it was comforting. His phone buzzed with a new message from Sarah: "Elijah, you're starting to make waves. Keep going. We're behind you 100%. Let's talk tomorrow about your next steps. You've got this." He smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. The next steps would come, but for now, he allowed himself to savor the moment. The feeling of having created something meaningful, of being seen and heard, and of knowing that his journey was just beginning. As he closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him, Elijah knew one thing for certain: he was finally on the right path. The world was listening, and he had only just begun to share his truth. The days following the release of Elijah's single felt like a blur. His music had found an audience, and the positive feedback flooded in from all directions. Fans, bloggers, even some well-known musicians, were reaching out to him, offering praise and support. But as his popularity grew, so did the pressure. His inbox was filled with messages from producers, promoters, and brands looking to collaborate, and the weight of it all began to sink in. Elijah had achieved something he had dreamed of for years: he was being heard. But now, the challenge was balancing this newfound attention with his commitment to his art. Each day, Elijah found himself being pulled in 100 different directions. He had to write new music, attend meetings with Rising Stars Media, and perform at small venues to build his reputation. The schedule was relentless. At first, it was exciting, almost intoxicating. But after a few weeks, the constant demand started to feel overwhelming. His once quiet studio, the sanctuary where he'd poured his heart into his music, began to feel more like a pressure cooker. The internal conflict was harder than ever. Elijah had signed with Rising Stars Media with the hope of reaching a wider audience, but he didn't want to lose himself in the process. He had always believed that his music was about more than fame or success, it was about connection, authenticity, and truth. But how could he maintain that focus when the world was constantly asking for more? One morning, after a particularly long night of recording, Elijah woke up to a message from Carla. She had been his closest friend since his early days of music, always there to support him through the highs and lows. They hadn't had much time to talk lately, with Elijah being so caught up in his whirlwind schedule, but her words brought him a sense of peace. "Elijah, I know things have been crazy lately, but I just wanted to remind you that you are doing this for the right reasons. Don't let the noise distract you. Keep your heart in the music. The world will come to you, but you need to stay true to yourself." The words resonated with Elijah deeply. In that moment, he realized how much he had strayed from the quiet, introspective artist he once was. The pressure to succeed, the fear of falling behind in an industry that moved at lightning speed, it had all taken its toll on him. Carla's message was a reminder to take a step back and reassess why he started this journey in the first place. He walked to his studio, determined to reclaim his creative space. As he sat at the piano, Elijah took a deep breath, letting the weight of his worries fall away. The pressure of the music industry, the deadlines, the expectations, they were all real, but they didn't have to define him. The music was still his, and he could still control how it was shared with the world. He began to play. The notes flowed freely, unburdened by the demands of the outside world. For the first time in weeks, Elijah felt a sense of calm. The music was his refuge. It was a place where no one could tell him what to do or how to feel. It was just him, the piano, and the truth of his emotions. The following week, Elijah decided to take a break from the constant hustle of meetings and interviews. He called Sarah, explaining that he needed some time to regroup, to find himself again. She was understanding, but her response was mixed with concern. "Take the time you need, Elijah. But remember, the momentum is here. We don't want to lose it. The world is paying attention. Just don't let this break turn into something more." Elijah reassured her that he was committed, but he knew that he needed to reconnect with his music before he could move forward. He knew that if he didn't take this time now, he might risk losing the very thing that made his music authentic in the first place. He headed out of the city for a few days, retreating to a small cabin in the mountains. It was the kind of place that offered solitude without distractions, where the only sounds were the wind and the distant rush of a river. Elijah had come here to reset. The world outside was moving fast, but here, in the quiet, he could breathe. The days in the cabin were filled with long walks, quiet reflection, and, most importantly, music. Without the pressure of deadlines or expectations, Elijah could play for hours without interruption. He wrote new melodies, revisited old ideas, and allowed himself to feel the emotions that had once fueled his creativity. The peace of the mountains allowed him to remember why he had started making music in the first place. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Elijah sat on the porch, his guitar in hand. He strummed softly, lost in the music. He thought about the road ahead. There would be more decisions to make, more opportunities to navigate, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready. Ready to take the next step, but only when it was the right one. His phone buzzed, interrupting the quiet moment. It was a message from Carla. "How's the retreat going? Hope you're finding some peace." Elijah smiled, typing back quickly. "I'm getting there. It's been good. Just needed some space to breathe. I think I've found the direction I need to take." He sent the message and looked out at the vast expanse of nature before him. The silence, the beauty of it all, was what had allowed him to reconnect with the music. It was the same silence that had once terrified him, but now it was a source of strength, a foundation for his next step. As Elijah returned to the city a few days later, he felt different. His mind was clearer, his heart lighter. He was ready to face the next phase of his career, but with a renewed sense of purpose. The music was still the heart of it all, and as long as he stayed true to that, everything else would fall into place. The first thing he did was call Sarah. She answered quickly, her voice a mix of surprise and concern. "Elijah. How are you? We were starting to wonder where you went off to." "I'm back," Elijah said, his voice calm but resolute. "I needed to take a step back and reconnect with what really matters. I'm ready to move forward, but this time, it's going to be on my terms." Sarah was silent for a moment, then responded, "I'm glad you took the time for yourself. That's important. So, what's next?" "I want to release something new," Elijah said. "Something that reflects this journey, this growth. I think the world needs to hear it." Sarah's tone softened. "We're with you, Elijah. Whatever you need, we'll make it happen." As the days turned into weeks, Elijah found himself once again immersed in his music. This time, however, he was more intentional. Every note he played, every lyric he wrote, carried the weight of the lessons he had learned. He was no longer chasing validation or success. He was creating for the sake of creation. And in that, he had found a new sense of freedom. The road ahead would still be filled with challenges. There would be more decisions to make, more compromises to navigate. But Elijah knew now that as long as he stayed true to his heart, he could face whatever came next. In a small studio, surrounded by friends and fans who had come to believe in his music, Elijah finally began to play his new song. The music was softer now, more introspective, but it was powerful in its honesty. It wasn't just a reflection of who he was, it was a statement of who he had become. And in that moment, Elijah knew that this was only the beginning of his journey. As Elijah prepared to release his new single, there was a sense of both excitement and anxiety that lingered in his chest. The quiet days spent in the cabin were now a distant memory, and the world was pulling him back into its fast-paced rhythm. Rising Stars Media had launched a massive campaign around his upcoming track, and the weight of expectation was heavier than he had anticipated. It wasn't just about the music anymore, it was about proving that he could sustain the success he'd achieved. Could he continue to meet the demands of the industry without losing sight of his truth? Elijah spent hours at the piano, trying to capture the right mood for his next release. The notes came easily enough, but there was a tightness in his chest every time he pressed play. He wasn't sure if it was the pressure or the fear of disappointing his fans and the label, but it felt as though every song was now scrutinized under a magnifying glass. Every note had to be perfect. Every lyric had to resonate. Every beat had to be groundbreaking. There was no room for mistakes. It was a daunting realization, one that almost felt like a betrayal of the very reason he started making music. Music was supposed to be his outlet, his escape. It was supposed to be his truth, not a carefully crafted product. But now, as he sat before the glowing screen of his computer, looking at the album artwork, the promotional plans, and the endless lists of social media posts that would follow the release, he felt like just another cog in the machine. But despite the internal turmoil, he couldn't deny the truth: this was the price of success. Elijah had worked his entire life to get here, and now that he was standing on the edge of something bigger than he had ever imagined, he had to decide what kind of artist he wanted to be. Would he remain true to himself? Or would he give in to the overwhelming noise around him? The day of the release came faster than he had expected. Elijah had finished the song, a deeply personal track titled "Between the Lines," and sent it off to the label for final approval. The song was a raw reflection of everything he had learned over the past few months. It was softer than his previous single, more reflective. It spoke of the dissonance he had felt between the version of himself the world saw and the version of himself he truly was. There were moments of doubt, moments of yearning, and moments of hope, but overall, it felt like an honest portrayal of his journey. But as the release date drew closer, Elijah's nerves began to fray. The pressure was mounting. He hadn't realized how much he had allowed the expectations of others to creep into his mind. And now, every time he thought about the song, he couldn't escape the question: what if they don't like it? The label had already hyped up the release, with teasers on social media, interviews with music blogs, and even a live stream event planned for the launch. Elijah knew that this wasn't just a release, it was a statement. It was his moment to solidify his place in the industry. But with that realization came the undeniable truth that there was no going back. Elijah spent the night before the release in a restless haze. His phone buzzed with notifications, messages from Sarah, from friends, from people who were already excited about the track. His mind raced. He felt the weight of the music industry bearing down on him, pushing him to keep up with its fast-moving pace. Every text, every call, every update felt like a reminder that there was no room for mistakes. He knew that the road ahead was uncertain, but the choice was clear: he could either continue on this path, riding the momentum, or he could make a decision to redefine success on his own terms. The day of the release, Elijah sat alone in his apartment. The world outside seemed to pulse with energy, but he felt strangely detached from it. He had spent the last few months climbing this mountain, and now that he was at the top, he wasn't sure if the view was worth the climb. His phone buzzed with more messages, more social media posts, more calls from the label, checking in on the rollout. The song was live. It was out there. The world could hear it. The first few hours passed in a blur. Elijah sat with his phone, refreshing his notifications every few minutes, waiting for the feedback to pour in. It wasn't until later in the day, when the initial wave of excitement had died down, that he began to read the comments. The first few were positive. Fans expressed how much they loved the vulnerability in the song, how it had connected with them on a personal level. But as he scrolled further, there were more critical voices. Some said the song was too soft, too introspective. Others questioned whether Elijah was losing his edge. The doubt started to creep in. Was he really losing his edge? Was he becoming too soft, too vulnerable, too real? The comments were like small needles, each one poking at his confidence. The weight of the opinions of strangers began to overwhelm him. As the evening wore on, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a fine line between staying true to his heart and giving in to the pressures of the industry. The very thing that had made him unique, his authenticity, was now being questioned. Was it enough to just be himself, or did he need to meet the demands of an industry that seemed to prioritize anything but sincerity? His phone rang. It was Sarah. "Hey, Elijah," she said, her voice warm but with an edge of concern. "How's it going?" "I don't know," Elijah responded honestly. There's so much pressure. It's like, the moment I release something, I'm already being criticized for it. I thought I could handle it, but now I'm questioning everything. Was the song too much? Too soft?" Sarah paused before responding, her tone steady and calming. "Elijah, this is the reality of being in the spotlight. People are going to have opinions, and some of those opinions will be harsh. But at the end of the day, you have to remember why you made this music in the first place. You did it because it was true to you. That's what matters. Don't let anyone take that away from you." Elijah leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words settling over him. It was a simple truth, but it felt like a lifeline. In that moment, he realized that the only person whose opinion mattered was his own. He didn't need to chase the approval of others. He just needed to keep creating from a place of authenticity. "Thanks, Sarah," he said quietly. "I needed to hear that." The next few days were a whirlwind. Despite his initial doubts, the song continued to gain traction. The mixed reviews didn't stop the track from gaining streams, and more fans began sharing their personal stories about how the song resonated with them. Elijah's message had gotten through. The song had found its audience. And as the numbers kept climbing, Elijah felt a quiet confidence returning. He didn't have to please everyone. He just had to stay true to himself. In the end, that was what would endure. As the weeks passed, Elijah found his rhythm again. He realized that the path ahead wasn't about pleasing the masses, it was about staying committed to his truth. He would continue to grow, continue to evolve, but he would never again compromise who he was for the sake of fame or success. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Elijah was no longer afraid of the weight of expectation. He had learned to carry it with grace, knowing that his authenticity was his greatest strength. The weeks that followed Elijah's release of Between the Lines were a whirlwind. To his surprise, the song began to rise in the charts, and the reviews, while mixed, only seemed to fuel the discussion. It was as though the track had tapped into something deep within his listeners, something real. People who had felt invisible, lost, or disconnected from their own lives reached out to him, sharing stories of how his music had resonated with them. It was the kind of response that made every moment of self-doubt worth it. Yet despite the growing buzz, Elijah couldn't help but feel an underlying unease. Yes, his music was being heard. Yes, it was connecting with people. But the industry's expectations, what they wanted from him next, how they wanted him to evolve, were weighing on him. There was pressure to keep producing, to keep delivering, to keep up with the demands of fame. He had to strike while the iron was hot, as the old saying went. Elijah had always been a man of deep reflection, someone who needed time to think things through. The balance between artistry and the grind of the industry was delicate, and he knew he had to tread carefully. It wasn't just about creating music anymore, it was about creating a brand, a persona, an image that could sustain the success. As much as he had dreamed of this moment, the reality of it, the never-ending cycle of production, promotion, and performance, was starting to feel like a machine that he was part of but didn't quite control. He spent hours in his studio, working on new material. But there was a change in the air. The music no longer flowed as easily. It wasn't that he had lost his passion for it, it was just that the pressures around him made it hard to focus on why he started making music in the first place. The joy of the creative process had begun to feel like a job. The genuine moments of self-expression were now tangled with deadlines, marketing strategies, and the constant need to prove himself. One day, in the middle of an intense writing session, Elijah found himself stuck. He had a melody in his head, but the words wouldn't come. His fingers hovered over the piano keys, but nothing felt right. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something deeper that he had been neglecting. It was as if his music was no longer his own, it was for the world, for the industry, for the fans. But what about him? What about the raw emotion, the vulnerability, the truth that had once been the core of his music? He pushed back from the piano, frustrated. There had to be a way to break through this wall, to reconnect with the feeling that had first made him fall in love with music. His phone buzzed on the table, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text from Sarah. "Hey, I've been thinking. I know things have been crazy lately, but maybe it's time we step back. Let's not just create music to meet the market. What if you took a little break, no deadlines, no expectations? Just you, your piano, and the music. I think you'll find your rhythm again." Elijah stared at the message for a long moment, the words sinking in. A break. A chance to step back from the frenzy of the industry. It was what he needed, he realized. He needed space to rediscover his passion without the constant pressure. The pressure to produce hits. The pressure to build a following. The pressure to be something the world wanted him to be. He hadn't taken a step back since he first entered the music scene, and maybe that was the key. What if he let go of the expectation to create the next big thing, and focused solely on creating from his heart again? Elijah decided to take Sarah's advice. The very next day, he packed a bag and drove out to a secluded cabin by the lake, far from the noise and distractions of the city. It was the same cabin he had visited a few months earlier, when he needed to reconnect with his music and himself. He didn't tell anyone he was going, just needed some time alone to reset. As soon as Elijah arrived, the calmness of the place washed over him. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the quiet hum of nature, the gentle lapping of water against the shore, it all felt like a welcome embrace. He sat by the lake, staring out over the water as the sun began to set, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. He had taken the first step towards something important, taking control of his path again, not by pushing harder, but by stepping back and finding clarity. He spent the next few days in solitude, walking through the woods, reflecting on the music he had written and the pressures he had faced. Without the weight of industry demands, he was able to listen to his inner voice again. Slowly, the music began to come back to him. Not the polished, produced sound that the world expected, but raw, honest melodies that spoke to his soul. He began to write with no intention other than to express himself fully. His songs were now a reflection of his truth, not a product for the world to consume. On the 5th day of his retreat, Elijah sat at the old piano in the cabin and began to play. His fingers moved over the keys with ease, as though they had never stopped. The melody that came out was simple but beautiful. It was the sound of him reconnecting with his art, of him finding peace in the chaos. He wrote the lyrics as if they were being dictated to him, flowing effortlessly from his heart. He wasn't trying to write something commercial or marketable. He was simply being honest with himself. I am the storm and the calm. I am the silence and the noise. I am the space between the lines. Where you and I will find our voice. When he finished the song, he sat back, staring at the piano. It was everything he had been missing. It was a return to his roots, a rediscovery of why he made music in the first place. This was the music he wanted to share with the world. Not because it was trendy or because it fit into some mold, but because it was his truth. Elijah spent the rest of his retreat recording the song, letting the music flow through him as he captured the raw, unfiltered emotion. He didn't worry about perfection. He didn't worry about how it would be received. He simply allowed the music to come to life. When the recording was finished, he felt a sense of release. It wasn't just the song that had been created, it was the artist he had rediscovered within himself. He was ready. Returning to the city, Elijah knew that the next step was crucial. He had a choice. He could go back to the grind, to the pressure, and continue down the path of industry expectations, or he could share this new music, this new version of himself, and let the world see him for who he truly was. He knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was moving forward with purpose. Elijah was no longer running from the pressure or hiding behind the industry's expectations. He was embracing his truth, and that, he realized, was the breakthrough he had been searching for. Elijah returned from the retreat with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in months. The song he had written, Between the Lines, was a reflection of everything he had been through, the doubt, the pressure, the self-exploration. It was more than just music to him now, it was a statement. He had rediscovered his love for creating, and now he was ready to share that with the world. But he also knew that sharing his truth would come with its own set of challenges. After days of reflection in the cabin, Elijah returned to the city, armed with new music and a new mindset. The world hadn't stopped moving while he had taken his break. The label, his team, and the fans were still waiting for what came next. But Elijah felt different now, less like a cog in the wheel and more like an artist. He had taken a step back and come face to face with his fears and his passions, and now, he was ready to confront the next stage of his journey. But there was still one big question weighing on him: how would the world react to the new music? The first person Elijah contacted when he returned was Sarah. Their relationship had grown over the past few months. Through the ups and downs, she had been there, offering support and advice when he needed it most. She was one of the few people who truly understood what Elijah was going through. "Elijah, you're back," Sarah said when she picked up the phone. "How was the retreat?" "It was exactly what I needed," Elijah replied, his voice full of quiet confidence. "I've got a new song. It's raw, it's real. I'm ready to share it. But I'm nervous about how people will take it. It's not like my other stuff. It's deeper. More vulnerable." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Elijah could feel her thoughtful pause on the other end. Then, her voice came back strong and supportive. "You've got to be proud of it, Elijah. This is your truth. You've been searching for it for so long. Now, it's time to show the world who you really are. If they can't handle that, then they weren't your people to begin with." Elijah nodded even though she couldn't see him. He had heard these words before, but now, they felt different. This time, he wasn't just taking a risk for the sake of his career. He was taking it for himself. It was his soul he was putting out there. "Thanks, Sarah," he said softly. "You're right. It's time." In the coming days, Elijah worked closely with his label to strategize the release. They wanted to continue the momentum of his previous success but knew that his latest song was a departure from what had brought him his fame. The marketing team was worried that it wouldn't fit the mold of his typical sound, but Elijah insisted they stay true to the vision he had cultivated. It wasn't about fitting into a box anymore, it was about making music that spoke to his heart. The single was scheduled for release on the same day as a live event where Elijah would perform the song for the first time. The media had been buzzing for weeks about his upcoming performance, and the excitement was palpable. His team was confident that this performance would be the moment to solidify his place as a genuine artist, not just a manufactured pop star. The night of the live event, Elijah stood backstage, pacing nervously. The lights outside the stage were blinding, the noise from the crowd deafening. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. As the minutes ticked away, his stomach churned, and his heart raced. He was no longer the same person who had walked into this industry years ago. He had changed. He had found his voice. But would the world embrace it? "You good?" came a voice from behind him. Elijah turned around to see Sarah standing there, smiling softly. She was dressed in casual clothes, but there was a warmth and familiarity to her presence that immediately put him at ease. "Yeah, just, nerves," Elijah said, his voice shaky despite his best efforts. "This is different from anything I've done before. I don't want to disappoint anyone." "Who are you worried about disappointing?" Sarah asked gently. "The people who are listening because they expect you to fit some mold? Or the people who are listening because they want to hear your truth?" Elijah looked at her, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It was as though she had read his mind. "The second group," he said quietly. "It's just hard, you know. You put yourself out there, and it feels like everything's on the line." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've already won, Elijah. You found yourself, and that's more than most people can say. Just let the music speak for itself. You don't have to do anything else." Elijah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had always known that it wasn't about the fame or the numbers, it was about creating something real. He had found that again. Now, it was time to trust that. The lights dimmed, signaling that it was time for Elijah's performance. Sarah squeezed his shoulder once more before walking off to take her place in the audience. As Elijah stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted into applause. It was a familiar feeling, the rush of adrenaline, the weight of expectation, but this time, it felt different. He wasn't nervous about what they would think of him. He was nervous about whether he could give them a piece of himself that they would connect with. He sat at the piano, his fingers brushing against the keys. The first few notes were soft and tentative, but as the song began to take shape, so did Elijah's confidence. His voice, once unsure, found its place in the music. With every word, he was no longer just performing for an audience. He was sharing his soul. As the song finished, the room fell silent for a beat. Then, the applause erupted, louder than he could have ever expected. Elijah felt a flood of relief and joy course through him. It wasn't just the cheers that made him feel fulfilled, it was the knowledge that he had stayed true to himself, and the world had heard it. Later that night, Elijah sat in his dressing room, replaying the performance in his mind. The nerves had been overwhelming, but he had survived it. The music had been heard, and it had connected with people in a way he hadn't anticipated. The feedback began pouring in. Fans flooded his social media with messages of support, sharing how the song had touched them. His single was already climbing the charts, and critics were praising him for his honesty and growth as an artist. But it wasn't just the success that made Elijah smile. It was the feeling of peace that had washed over him on stage. He knew he had done something important, not just for his career, but for himself. He had faced the world again, not as the person the industry wanted him to be, but as the person he had always been. For the first time in a long time, Elijah knew that the path ahead, while uncertain, was his to walk. And no matter where it led, he would be walking it with his head held high, proud of the music he was making, proud of the person he had become. The days that followed Elijah's performance were a whirlwind of success. His new song, Between the Lines, soared in the charts, and his live performance had garnered widespread praise. The media buzzed with excitement over his raw honesty and emotional depth. His fans couldn't stop talking about the vulnerability he'd shared with the world. For the first time, Elijah felt like he was being recognized for who he truly was as an artist, not just the image the industry had tried to shape him into. But as much as the praise felt good, Elijah couldn't escape the nagging feeling that the storm wasn't over yet. Success came with its own set of pressures. He had taken a risk by releasing such a deeply personal song, and while many had embraced it, others were more skeptical. The music industry, after all, thrived on trends, on what's new and what's commercially viable. Between the Lines was far from the typical pop hit that fans expected from him, and Elijah knew that not everyone would understand or appreciate it the way his core supporters did. It was one thing to create something from the heart, but it was another to face the backlash that often came with deviating from what was popular. It didn't take long for the first critical reviews to trickle in. The first one hit him like a punch to the gut. The review was from a respected critic who had once praised his earlier work but now seemed to have turned on him. The critic accused Elijah of losing his commercial edge and being self-indulgent in his new direction. It stung, especially because the words hit close to the fears Elijah had been wrestling with. Was his shift too much for people? Was he making the right decision? More reviews followed, some positive but others tinged with doubt. The common theme was that Elijah's new sound, while bold and emotionally raw, didn't fit the mold of the mainstream pop market. The critics said it was too slow, too introspective, too risky. Many questioned whether it would resonate with a wider audience, with the young fans who had made him a household name. For the first time since the release, Elijah found himself questioning his own choices. Was he sacrificing his future for something that felt good in the moment? Was he losing touch with the audience that had helped him rise in the first place? The questions looped in his mind, gnawing at him as he lay in bed late at night, staring at the ceiling. Maybe I pushed too far, he murmured aloud to himself. Maybe I've gone too deep. Sarah was the first person he called after reading the negative reviews. She had always been his sounding board, the one person who understood the internal struggle he faced. Elijah, I saw the reviews, she said calmly when she picked up the phone. I know they sting. But you have to remember, you can't let others define what you're doing. You created something real, something true to you. Not everyone is going to get it, and that's okay. I don't know, Sarah, Elijah admitted, his voice tight. I've been in this industry long enough to know that it's all about what sells. And if my music isn't what people want right now, then what's next for me? What if I'm just fading out? Sarah took a deep breath. You know how I feel about that. It's not about following the trends, Elijah. It's about creating something that matters. I know it's scary, but the people who really matter, the ones who connect with your message, who see you for who you truly are, they're not going to walk away because of one review. If anything, they'll be more loyal than ever. Elijah didn't respond immediately, instead leaning back in his chair and closing his eyes. Sarah was right. He couldn't let the opinions of a few critics define him. But the fear, the doubt, still clung to him. The music industry was fickle, and if he wanted to stay relevant, he couldn't afford to be written off so easily. "You're right," he finally said, though his voice still carried the weight of uncertainty. "But what if this is the beginning of the end for me? What if I can't go back to the way things were?" "Elijah," Sarah said softly, "that's exactly it. You're not supposed to go back. That's not how growth works. What you're doing, what you've done with Between the Lines, is taking a step forward. It's a risk, and not everyone will get it right away. But that doesn't mean you're finished. It means you're on the edge of something new, something bigger. Just trust the process. Trust yourself." The words hung in the air between them for a long moment, and Elijah felt a flicker of hope spark within him. Sarah was right. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of something new. But still, he couldn't shake the fear that the industry was already moving on, already demanding the next big thing, the next trend. He exhaled deeply, trying to steady his thoughts. "I'm scared, Sarah. I'm scared that I'm about to lose everything." "You won't lose anything that matters," she replied firmly. "You've already found something better. You found your true voice. And I know that's the kind of thing people will come back to, time and time again. Maybe not everyone will understand it right away, but the ones who do, those are the ones who will stick with you." Despite Sarah's encouragement, Elijah couldn't escape the fear and anxiety that seemed to hang over him like a dark cloud. The reviews kept coming, both good and bad. But even as he read the praise from some fans, the negative voices felt louder. The pressure to conform to the expectations of the industry was overwhelming. It was like walking a tightrope, trying to balance between staying true to himself and pleasing the people who had made him famous. He threw himself back into writing and recording, hoping that the act of creation would help drown out the noise. But with every new track, he felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. His doubts crept back in, telling him that he wasn't enough, that the music he was making was too personal, too raw, too different. Then, one afternoon, Elijah found himself alone in the studio, staring at his piano. He had just finished another song, a reflection of his fears and doubts, and he felt nothing. No connection, no spark. It was as though he was losing himself in the process, losing the very thing that had made his music special. Suddenly, he realized something. He wasn't just afraid of the criticism from the outside world, he was afraid of losing himself again, of going back to the place where music felt like a product, not a passion. He had come so far, but now, he was at a crossroads. He had to make a choice. Was he going to let the criticism define him, or was he going to continue creating for the sake of his own truth? Elijah took a deep breath and sat down at the piano. For the first time in weeks, he played without thinking about the industry, without worrying about what people would say. He played for himself. And in that moment, something shifted. The music flowed. The melody was pure, unfiltered, and full of emotion. It was exactly what he needed, exactly what he had been missing. This wasn't just a song. It was a declaration. He wasn't going to let the critics or the fear control him. He was going to keep pushing forward, keep being real, keep being Elijah. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The weight of Elijah's decision to stay true to his music, despite the pressure and criticism, felt heavy at times, but the moment of clarity he had experienced in the studio was like a spark that refused to be dimmed. He was done doubting himself. The critics could say what they wanted, but Elijah was no longer willing to let their opinions shape his journey. The only opinion that mattered now was his own. He had rediscovered the most important thing, why he made music in the first place. But while Elijah had come to peace with his artistic choices, the world around him was still spinning. The label, his management team, and the public were all holding their breath, wondering what his next move would be. Elijah had already decided, he would push forward with the release of his new album, regardless of the risk. It was time for him to make his statement to the world, and it wasn't going to be dictated by anyone else's expectations. The phone call came early one morning, just as Elijah was sipping his coffee and reviewing his thoughts for the day. His manager, Grace, was on the other end of the line, and her voice had the crisp, business-like tone that always made him sit up straight. "Elijah, we need to talk," Grace said, her words measured. "I just got off the phone with the label. They're concerned." Elijah's stomach tightened. He had been expecting this moment, but now that it was here, the reality was much more daunting than he had anticipated. "Concerned? About what?" Elijah asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Your upcoming album," Grace replied. "The label feels that the direction you're taking with these songs might alienate your fan base. They're worried it won't sell as well as your previous work. They want you to rethink a few tracks, maybe throw in something a little more commercial." Elijah closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. The same thing he had feared was happening. The pull between staying true to himself and the pressure to conform was stronger than ever. "I'm not changing the songs, Grace," he said firmly. "I've worked too hard to get here. I'm not going to water down what I believe in just to make a quick sale. This album is me. If they can't accept that, then maybe we need to rethink this partnership." There was a brief silence on the other end of the phone, and Elijah could almost hear the wheels turning in Grace's mind. She knew what he was saying. This wasn't just about an album anymore. This was about his identity, about how he wanted to be remembered in the industry. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" Grace asked, her voice softening. "I get it, Elijah. But you need to understand, if you go down this road, there's a chance the public might not follow. And I'm not just talking about the critics. Fans change, tastes evolve." "I get that," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "But I'm not making music for the fans I think I should have. I'm making music for the ones who listen because they know who I really am. If that means I lose a few along the way, then so be it. I'm ready to take that risk." Grace exhaled, and for the first time in the conversation, Elijah could sense a hint of admiration in her tone. "Okay, Elijah," she said, sounding resolute. "You've made your choice. We'll proceed with the album as it is, but you need to be prepared. There might be fallout." "I'm prepared," Elijah said. "This is my truth. I'm ready to face whatever comes next." The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Elijah continued working tirelessly in the studio, finishing the final tracks for the album. But despite his resolve, doubts still crept in. The pressure from the label wasn't going away, and the marketing team had already begun crafting an image that still didn't quite fit with the music he had created. They insisted that he needed a more polished, public persona, someone more in line with the polished pop idols who dominated the charts. But Elijah refused. He was determined to be himself, even if that meant standing apart from the pack. Then came the day that the album was finally complete. Elijah stood in front of the studio, looking out at the city skyline as he took a deep breath. It was over. The music was done. Now, the world would decide whether they were ready for this new chapter of his career, or whether he was too far ahead of them. He was scheduled for an exclusive interview with one of the most influential music journalists in the industry, a woman named Natalie Marks. Natalie had been covering the music scene for years and had a reputation for being both tough and fair. If there was anyone who could understand what Elijah was trying to do, it was her. This interview would be the moment of truth, the moment when Elijah would lay it all out and tell the world why he had chosen this path. The day of the interview arrived. Elijah stood backstage at the television studio, his hands slightly trembling as he prepared to face the cameras. He knew the stakes. If he could win Natalie over, he might have a shot at convincing the wider public that his new direction was worth the risk. When the cameras finally turned on, Elijah felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had faced bigger crowds before. But this time, it wasn't about performing. It was about being authentic. It was about telling his story. Natalie looked at him with a discerning gaze. "Elijah, thank you for joining me today. We're here to talk about your new album, Between the Lines. You've taken a lot of risks with this one, shifting away from the commercial sound that made you famous. What led to this change? Elijah smiled, leaning into the moment. It wasn't just a change. It was a shift in how I see myself as an artist. I've spent years chasing after what people expected of me, trying to fit into this mold that I never quite belonged in. I wanted to break free from that. This album is my chance to show the world who I really am. It's vulnerable. It's personal. But it's also honest. Natalie nodded, clearly intrigued. That's quite a departure. But there's been some criticism about this album. Some people say that it's too introspective, that it's not commercial enough. What do you say to those who think you've lost touch with your fans? Elijah paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts. This was the question he had been preparing for. I say to them, you're probably right. It's not for everyone. But here's the thing, I've learned that I can't create for anyone else but myself. If my fans can't appreciate this version of me, then maybe they weren't really my fans to begin with. I've always said that I want to make music that speaks to the heart, and that's exactly what this album does. I'm not asking anyone to love it. But I am asking them to hear it. There was a brief silence as Natalie absorbed his words. Finally, she leaned forward. Elijah, I have to say, that's one of the most honest answers I've heard in a long time. But let me ask you this, are you prepared for the possibility that the public might not embrace this new direction? What if this is the end of the road for you? Elijah's gaze didn't waver. If that happens, then at least I can say I went out on my own terms. But I don't think it will be the end. I think people are craving something real, something authentic. And maybe it won't be the easiest journey, but I'm ready for whatever comes next. Because at the end of the day, this music, my music, is who I am. The interview was a turning point for Elijah. As the conversation wound down and the cameras stopped rolling, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had told the world exactly what he needed to say, and for the first time in a long while, he was completely at peace with the choices he had made. The album's release came soon after. There were mixed reactions from both fans and critics. Some were ecstatic, praising the depth and raw emotion of Elijah's work. Others criticized him for straying too far from the formula that had made him a star. But despite the differing opinions, one thing was clear, Elijah had made an impact. His music was being heard, and it was impossible to ignore. But in the end, Elijah wasn't concerned with being accepted by everyone. He had done what he set out to do, he had shared his truth with the world. And that was enough. The release of Between the Lines was met with a mix of excitement, confusion, and skepticism. Elijah had known from the beginning that the album was a gamble, his most personal and raw work yet, but he couldn't have anticipated the whirlwind that would follow its debut. Within hours of the album's release, social media exploded with reactions. Some fans praised the depth and emotion of the tracks, while others struggled to understand the new direction he had taken. The first few days after the album dropped were filled with a constant stream of messages, interviews, and press statements. Elijah's inbox was flooded, not just with fan messages but also with opinions from critics, both positive and negative. The critics who had once called him the future of pop were now accusing him of abandoning the genre that made him famous. Yet, there was a surprising group of new fans, listeners who had never followed his work before, but who were now drawn to the vulnerability and authenticity in his music. It was early the next morning when Grace called. Elijah had just woken up, his eyes bleary from the sleepless nights spent reading tweets, blog posts, and news articles about his album. The calls for change, for him to return to his old style, were louder than ever. Yet, amidst all the noise, there was a quiet satisfaction in his heart. He was finally living his truth. Elijah, we need to talk, Grace said, her voice unusually urgent. He sighed but sat up straighter. What's going on? Look, the album's a hit in some circles. But we're getting some pretty brutal reviews from mainstream outlets. The label's already talking about backing out of the promotional tour, and there are whispers about scrapping the entire project. You need to make a decision. Elijah felt a tightness in his chest, but his resolve was unshaken. The doubts, the fear, they were still there, lurking just under the surface. But they had no place now. I'm not backing down, Grace. I made my choice, and I'm sticking with it. I know it's not going to be easy. But this is who I am. If people can't see that, then that's on them. Grace didn't answer immediately, and for a long moment, there was just the faint hum of silence between them. Elijah could tell that Grace was struggling with her own conflict, her loyalty to him and her desire to protect his career in the face of potential failure. I don't like the direction this is heading, she finally said. But I get it, Elijah. If you want to go all in, then we'll support you. But you need to understand that this might take a while. It's going to be a long road ahead. Elijah nodded, even though Grace couldn't see it. He was ready for the long road. As the days passed, the initial criticism began to give way to something else. Word started to spread, among a different crowd, a group of listeners who weren't concerned with pop formulas or radio play. They were the ones who understood the message of Between the Lines. These were the people who had been waiting for an artist to stand up and tell their story without any filters. Elijah's music became a conversation, one that spread across underground blogs and indie radio stations. Elijah wasn't just a pop star anymore. He had become a symbol of artistic integrity, someone who had been brave enough to go against the grain. He began to see the shift. The comments, the reviews, the messages, they all started to change. More and more, fans expressed their appreciation for the rawness of the album. People started talking about it as if it wasn't just music, but a movement. And it wasn't just his existing fan base that had connected with it. People who had never considered Elijah a serious artist were now seeing him in a completely different light. The most surprising shift came from the very people who had initially mocked him. The critics, the industry execs, and even some of his former peers began to take notice. There were whispers about Between the Lines being nominated for major awards. But still, the mainstream success that Elijah had once enjoyed felt out of reach. The journey was not without its trials. The song still hadn't charted in the top 10, and the mainstream media was slow to warm up to the new, unapologetically raw version of Elijah. The public's reception was far from unanimous. But that was okay. Elijah had already reconciled with the fact that this wasn't a race. The turning point came when one of Elijah's longtime influences, a famous musician and composer named Daniel Mitchell, reached out to him. Daniel had been a staple in the music industry for decades, known for his innovative work across multiple genres. He had always kept a low profile but was widely respected as a creative genius. Elijah had idolized him for years, and the thought of speaking to him was both thrilling and intimidating. The message from Daniel was simple, yet powerful. Elijah, I've been listening to your album on repeat for the past few days. It's something I haven't heard in a long time, a true voice. Keep going. The world is ready for this kind of music. Don't let them drown you out. For Elijah, those words were like a validation he hadn't even known he needed. Here was a legend, someone whose music had shaped his own, telling him he was on the right path. Elijah knew, in that moment, that this was bigger than charts or record sales. This was about making music that mattered. The message from Daniel set the tone for the next chapter of Elijah's journey. With renewed conviction, Elijah began to focus on what came next. There was still the looming promotional tour to navigate, and he would need to continue facing the pressure from the label, but the words of Daniel Mitchell fueled a fire inside him. He wasn't alone in this anymore. The next few weeks saw a marked shift in public perception. People started to give the album a second listen, and this time, they were hearing something different. They were hearing the honesty, the pain, the beauty, the things that Elijah had been trying to communicate all along. The mainstream media began to slowly, but surely, shift its focus from the commercial, superficial aspects of pop music to the real heart of Elijah's work. His music began to be praised for its depth, its courage, its vulnerability. As the months passed, Elijah's music began to find a wider audience. He was invited to more intimate performances, smaller venues where he could connect directly with the people who understood what he was trying to say. These were the people who had been waiting for someone to create something authentic in an industry that was often driven by superficiality. And then came the announcement: Elijah was nominated for multiple Grammy Awards. The music industry, which had once dismissed him, was now recognizing him as an artist of immense talent and vision. It wasn't the kind of success he had once dreamed of, but it was more meaningful than anything he could have imagined. The recognition was different this time, not based on fleeting trends, but on the integrity of his craft. But even with all the accolades, the most fulfilling thing for Elijah was knowing that his message was being heard, loud and clear. He had stayed true to his art, and the world was responding. He had chosen the path of honesty over popularity, and while the road had been long and filled with obstacles, he was beginning to see the rewards that were far more valuable than any chart-topping single could ever be. The night of the Grammy Awards had arrived, and the glimmering lights of the venue seemed to pulse in rhythm with the beats of Elijah's heart. The whole experience felt surreal, almost too big for him to comprehend. As he stood in the massive crowd of stars, rubbing elbows with the biggest names in the music industry, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of disbelief. Was this really happening? A year ago, he would have never imagined that he, Elijah Matthews, the boy who had once been an outcast, mocked for his dreams, would be here, standing on the verge of something monumental. But even as the bright lights and the overwhelming atmosphere tried to pull him in, his mind kept drifting back to the journey that had led him here. It wasn't the Grammys, or the accolades, or the glitzy red carpet that defined this moment. It was the music, the raw, vulnerable, and real music that had pushed him to grow beyond the person he once was. Elijah had poured his soul into every note, every lyric, and in return, it had transformed him, connecting him to something far bigger than he ever imagined. And, standing there in his sharp black tuxedo, among the industry's elite, Elijah realized the true significance of what he had accomplished. This wasn't just about the applause of the crowd or the shimmer of trophies, it was about the truth of his voice being heard, and being validated. He had stayed true to himself, even when it felt like the world was telling him to fit into a box he didn't belong in. And now, it was all starting to make sense. The ceremony started, and with each award category announced, Elijah's heart pounded harder. He wasn't sure what to expect. Would he actually win something? Would his name be called? Or would he just be another artist who didn't fit the mold, left to watch from the sidelines? When it finally came time for Album of the Year, the category that had been on his mind for weeks, Elijah found himself holding his breath. His palms were clammy, and his chest tightened with a mixture of nerves and anticipation. He turned to Grace, who stood next to him, her smile warm but with an edge of concern in her eyes. She squeezed his hand reassuringly. Elijah Matthews, between the lines, the announcer said, his voice echoing through the hall. A split second of silence followed before the crowd erupted in applause. Elijah could barely hear it over the sound of his own pulse, thundering in his ears. For a moment, he didn't move. It wasn't disbelief, he had hoped for this, had worked for it. But still, the weight of the recognition was staggering. This was more than a win for him, it was validation for everything he had sacrificed. For the nights he spent questioning his decision to leave the comforts of mainstream pop behind. For the rejection he had felt, and the loneliness of walking a path few understood. Grace tugged at his sleeve. Go, Elijah. Go. He blinked, coming back to the moment, and with shaking hands, Elijah stepped forward, walking up the stage to accept his award. The moment felt almost dreamlike. He heard his own name again, Elijah Matthews, and it sounded surreal coming from the lips of 1,000 strangers, who were now celebrating him. Standing at the podium, with the Golden Grammy trophy in his hand, Elijah was overwhelmed. The words he had rehearsed in his head, the speeches he'd prepared for this moment, all evaporated in a rush of emotion. Instead, all he could say was, "Thank you. To everyone who believed in this, and to everyone who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. This one's for the dreamers, for the misfits, and for anyone who's ever had to fight to be heard." There was a pause before the audience erupted in applause. He didn't care about the standing ovation. He didn't care about the cameras flashing or the celebrities smiling in his direction. For Elijah, this was a moment of personal triumph, of knowing that he had finally made his mark. His music wasn't just an album, it was a testament to the power of resilience, to staying true to one's voice, no matter the obstacles. After the ceremony, the world continued to change around Elijah. His win at the Grammys became a turning point, a catalyst that launched him into a new phase of his career. The mainstream media began to pay attention in a different way. His music was now celebrated not just for its commercial appeal, but for its authenticity and vulnerability. Where he had once been dismissed, now there were articles written about him, detailing his transformation from a pop star to a true artist. But what mattered more to Elijah than the recognition was the way people were connecting with his music. The messages on social media, the letters from fans, and the feedback from listeners were a constant reminder that what he had done was worth it. His art was speaking to people in ways that he had always hoped it would. People who had been inspired to pursue their own dreams, who had been healed by his lyrics, who found hope in his vulnerability. Yet even with all this success, Elijah knew that the real journey was just beginning. Winning a Grammy didn't mean he could stop, there was still so much left to do, so much more music to make, so many more lives to touch. His win was just one step in a larger mission, and it wasn't about resting on his laurels. It was about continuing to evolve, to challenge the norms, and to speak his truth, no matter what. As he looked out over the city from his hotel room the night after the ceremony, Elijah reflected on how far he had come. From the shy, misunderstood boy who had spent his life in the shadows of others' expectations, to the artist who had now made his voice heard. He had crossed an ocean of doubt and fear, and the shore was finally in sight. But Elijah wasn't done yet. There were still songs to write, battles to fight, and dreams to chase. He wasn't just going to be remembered as a one-hit wonder or a fleeting pop star. He was going to create music that lasted. He was going to change the world, one song at a time. The next chapter of his story was unfolding, and Elijah was ready to step into it. The world had no idea what was coming next, but he did. And that was all that mattered. As he stood in front of the mirror, holding his Grammy close to his chest, Elijah whispered to himself, "This is just the beginning." Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?